The iron rim of the stagecoach wheel struck a submerged rock, sending a violent shudder through the wooden frame that rattled Nora Vance's teeth. She did not cry out. She had learned long ago that making a sound only invited attention, and attention was the very thing she had traveled 500 miles to escape. Outside the leather-flapped window, the Wyoming Territory stretched out in an endless, punishing expanse of gray sage and cracked earth. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the roof of the coach, shimmering in distorted waves off the dry grass. In the distance, the jagged teeth of the Bighorn Mountains tore at the belly of a pale, merciless sky. A solitary vulture circled high above, a black speck riding the thermals, waiting for something to die. Nora watched it with a grim sort of kinship. She felt as though she had been dying by degrees for 6 years, and she wondered if this new town, this bitter creek, would finally pick the bones clean. She shifted on the hard bench, her fingers tightening around the handle of her carpet bag. The leather was worn smooth, the stitching fraying at the corners, much like Nora herself. Inside her bodice, folded small and damp with sweat, lay the letter. It was a flimsy thing to pin a life on. Chambermaid wanted board and small wage. Ask for Mrs. Hatcher. The driver shouted something unintelligible to the team of 6 horses, and the coach lurched sideways before straightening. Dust, fine as flour and alkaline bitter, puffed through the cracks in the floorboards, settling into the creases of Nora's dark traveling dress. She brushed it away, but the dust of the West was not something one removed. It was something one accepted, like the wind or the silence. They crested a rise, and the town of Bitter Creek revealed itself below. It was a scar on the landscape, a cluster of timber and adobe clinging to the edge of a dry wash. There was no grandeur here, no promise of gold or glory. It was a working town, wind-beaten and sun-bleached. As the coach descended, the brakes screeching in protest, Nora saw the main street. It was a wide ribbon of dirt flanked by warped wooden sidewalks that looked ready to splinter under a heavy boot. The coach slowed, passing a half-built church where the skeleton of a steeple pointed an accusing finger at heaven. A livery stable exhaled the smell of wet hay and manure, and the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang out, counting the seconds like a slow heartbeat. When the stage finally shuddered to a halt in front of the depot, silence rushed in to fill the void left by the rumbling wheels. Nora took a breath, holding it deep in her lungs, and opened the door. She stepped down into the dust, her boots sinking an inch into the powder. The sun hit her with the force of a physical blow. Around her, the town seemed to pause. 2 men on a bench outside the freight office stopped whittling. A woman shaking a rug on a balcony froze, the dust cloud drifting from her hands. Eyes turned toward her. They were not welcoming eyes. They were measuring, calculating, looking for the cracks in her armor. In a town this small, a stranger was either a threat or a novelty, and Nora knew she looked too worn to be a novelty. She gathered her skirts and walked toward the largest building on the street, the sign above reading Gable's General Mercantile. She needed directions, and she needed water. Her throat felt lined with felt. The interior of the store was dim and smelled of coffee beans, calico, and sawdust. A woman stood behind the counter, wiping down a jar of pickled eggs with a rag. She was round-faced and neat, her hair pulled back so tight it pulled the corners of her eyes upward. "Good afternoon," Nora said, her voice raspy. The woman looked up, her smile practiced and polite. "Good afternoon to you." "Just off the stage, yes." Nora approached the counter, conscious of the dust on her sleeves. "I am looking for Mrs. Hatcher's boarding house. I have a position waiting there." The woman's smile held. "Oh, you are the new help, Mrs. Hatcher mentioned she had found someone from back east. I am Mrs. Gable. And you are?" "Nora Vance." The change was instantaneous. It was as if the air in the room had suddenly dropped 20 degrees. "Mrs." Gable's hand paused on the glass jar. The polite smile did not vanish, but it stiffened, transforming into a rictus of social obligation that barely covered a sudden, sharp distaste. Her eyes darted over Nora's face. searching for something. A scar, a mark of sin, a sign of the devil. "Vance, Mrs.," Gable repeated, the word tasting sour in her mouth. She wiped her hands on her apron, though they were not dirty. "I see. We received a letter from your former employer. It arrived 3 days ago. Mrs." Hatcher read it. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She had hoped to arrive before the mail, or at least before the whispers began. It seemed the telegraph or the fast post had outrun the stagecoach. "Is Mrs. Hatcher expecting me?" Nora asked, keeping her chin level despite the trembling in her knees. "Mrs." Gable looked past Nora toward the window, as if engaging in direct eye contact might transmit a disease. "She is. The house is at the north edge of town. 2 stories, gray paint peeling off. You cannot miss it. It looks tired." "Thank you," Nora said. She turned to leave, her back burning under the woman's gaze. As she reached the door, she heard Mrs. Gable mutter, low and sharp, to the empty room, bold as brass. "Showing her face here." Nora stepped back out into the blinding light, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They knew, or they thought they knew. Half-truths were often more dangerous than lies because they carried the weight of conviction. 1/4 of a mile away, at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to the sprawling emptiness of the stockyards, Silas Thorne sat atop a roan gelding that looked as hard-used as he was. He watched the cattle flow through the gate, a river of red and white hides, clicking horns, and dust. Silas was a man built of sharp angles and silence. He wore a canvas coat despite the heat, the collar turned up, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes the color of flint. He did not shout and whistle like the younger hands who rode the flanks of the herd. He merely shifted his weight in the saddle or turned his horse a fraction, and the cattle moved where he wanted them. He possessed a quiet competence that commanded respect, but it was a respect born of caution, not affection. He was 32 years old, but the lines around his eyes and the gray streaking his dark beard made him look older. He lived on a small ranch 3 miles out, alone, and that was how he preferred it. The town of Bitter Creek tolerated him because he sold good beef and paid his debts on time, but they did not invite him to Sunday dinner. They remembered the day he had ridden in 5 years ago, and they remembered the gunfight 2 years after that. "Easy now," Silas murmured to the roan as a steer broke from the group. He nudged the horse forward, cutting off the escape with a fluid motion. Once the cattle were penned, he rode toward the mercantile to deliver a supply list. He preferred to move along the alleyways and the fringes of the main street, avoiding the boardwalks where the townsfolk congregated to trade gossip and judgment. As he turned the corner near Gable's store, he pulled his horse up short. A woman stood in the dust near the hitching post. She was struggling with a heavy trunk that had been dumped unceremoniously by the stage driver. She was slight, her frame thin beneath a heavy traveling dress, but she was hauling at the leather handle with a grim determination. Standing 3 feet away, leaning against a support post and watching her struggle, was Jeb Gable. The storekeeper's son was 19, with a face full of pimples and eyes full of unearned arrogance. He was chewing on a piece of straw, grinning. "Need a hand there, darling?" Jeb asked, not moving an inch to help. "I can manage," the woman said. Her voice was low, strained with effort. "Heavy load for a lady." Jeb sneered. "I heard you were coming. Heard you were used to heavy loads. What kind of work you really here for, Miss Vance? Mama says women like you only have one kind of skill." The woman froze. She dropped the handle of the trunk, her shoulders hunching defensively. She did not look at the boy, but Silas saw her hands shaking. Silas urged the roan forward. The horse's hooves made no sound in the deep dust until he was almost upon them. "Jeb," Silas said. The boy jumped, spitting out the straw. He looked up, his arrogance faltering as he saw the shadow of the horse and rider looming over him. "Mr. Thorne, I was just helping the lady." "You have a strange way of helping," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a gravelly weight that made Jeb take a step back. "Your mother is calling you." Inside, Jeb flushed red. "She ain't calling me." Silas just looked at him. It was a flat, dead stare that promised nothing good. Jeb swallowed, mumbled something obscene under his breath, and ducked into the store, the bell jingling frantically behind him. Silas dismounted. He tied the roan to the rail and turned to the woman. She had backed away, pressing herself against the rough wood of the storefront. Her eyes were wide, dark, and terrified. She looked at him not as a savior, but as just another man, another potential threat. He walked to the trunk. It was a beast of a thing, reinforced with iron bands. He bent his knees, gripped the handle, and lifted it. It was heavy, packed solid with books or perhaps stones, but he swung it up onto his shoulder as if it were filled with feathers. "Where is it going?" he asked. The woman blinked, seemingly stunned that he hadn't asked for payment or a favor. The boarding house, Mrs. Hatcher's." Silas nodded. He started walking. She hesitated for a second, then hurried to catch up, though she kept a careful distance of 3 feet between them. "Thank you," she said after a moment. The words sounded rusty, unused. "No need," Silas replied, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "Jeb is a fool. His mouth runs faster than his mind." She did not answer. He could feel her watching him, analyzing his gait, the gun on his hip, the dust on his coat. She was like a wild mare he had once spent a month breaking, skittish, expecting the whip at every sudden movement. They reached the boarding house, a sagging 2-story structure at the north end of town where the wind hit hardest. The paint was indeed peeling, exposing gray, weathered wood that looked like old bone. Silas set the trunk down on the porch with a thud. He turned to look at her properly for the first time. She had a face that might have been pretty once, before worry had chiseled away the softness. Her eyes were a hazel color, flecked with green, but guarded by high walls. "Mrs. Hatcher is inside," Silas said. "Thank you," she repeated. She stood stiffly, shoulders squared, her chin lifted slightly. It was a pose of defiance. He realized she was bracing herself for him to say something cruel, or to make a pass. He tipped the brim of his hat. "Good luck. Miss Vance." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel. He felt her eyes on his back until he turned the corner. Mrs. Hatcher was a woman composed entirely of sharp edges. Her nose was sharp, her elbows were sharp, and her voice was a serrated knife. She stood in the hallway of the boarding house, blocking Nora's path to the stairs. "I run a respectable house," Mrs. Hatcher said. She did not offer a greeting. Her gray dress was buttoned to her chin. "Absolute discretion is required. You will rise at 4. You will start the fires, bake the biscuits, scrub the floors in the hallway and the dining room before the guests rise at 6. Laundry is on Tuesdays and Fridays. You will eat in the kitchen after the dishes are done." "I understand." Nora said, "The pay is $4 a month, minus breakage." Mrs. Hatcher's eyes narrowed. "And I know about you. The letter from St. Louis was quite detailed. I'm a Christian woman. Miss Vance, I believe in charity for the fallen. But if I see one man go up those stairs, if I smell spirits on your breath, if you bring a whisper of scandal to my door, you will be on the street before you can pack that trunk. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear," Nora whispered. "Your room is in the attic. Top of the stairs, the door on the left. It gets hot. You'll get used to it." Nora dragged her trunk up 2 flights of narrow, creaking stairs. The attic room was stifling, trapped heat radiating from the roof shingles. It contained a narrow iron cot with a thin mattress, a cracked wash basin, and a single window the size of a Bible. That night, Nora lay under the thin, scratchy blanket, staring at the exposed rafters. The town of Bitter Creek was alive outside. She could hear the distant, mournful howl of coyotes up in the foothills, a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. Closer, from the saloon 3 streets over, came the sound of a tinny piano and the rough, drunken laughter of men. The laughter made her stomach twist into a hard knot. It brought back the smell of stale whiskey and cigar smoke. She closed her eyes and saw Thomas. She saw the way his face would slacken when he drank, the way his hands, usually so clumsy, became precise instruments of pain. She remembered the bedroom in St. Louis, the door that locked from the outside, the sound of his heavy boots on the floorboards. "You're nothing without me, Nora, just a pretty thing with a dirty soul." She rolled over, pressing her face into the musty pillow to stifle a sob. She had run. She had taken the money from the tin under the floorboards, her own money, saved from sewing, and she had run until the rail line ended and the stagecoach began. She had promised herself this place would be different, but lying in the dark, listening to the men laugh, she felt the old dread coiling around her throat like a snake. The West was big, but she was beginning to fear it wasn't big enough to hide her. By noon the next day, the town of Bitter Creek had decided who Nora Vance was. The rumors started at the dressmaker's shop, where Mrs. Gable held court while measuring fabric for a new Sunday frock. "She killed him." "Mrs." Gable whispered, leaning in close to the Reverend's wife. "Poisoned his supper." That's what the letter said. Arsenic in the gravy. And she ran off before the law could prove it. At the church, the story twisted. No, Mrs. Miller corrected, adjusting her bonnet. "She wasn't a wife. She worked at one of those houses in St. Louis, the high-end ones. She stole a diamond brooch from a client and had to flee, in the saloon." The talk was coarser. A man who had seen her step off the stage spat into the spittoon. "Looked hard used to me. I bet she's looking for a rich rancher to bleed dry. Black Widow, that one." Silas Thorne stood at the far end of the bar, nursing a warm beer. He looked at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar, a dark shape in a room of noise. He heard the men talking 2 tables away. Their voices were loud, self-righteous, hungry for someone else's sin to make their own lives feel cleaner. "She's a murderess," one man said confidently. "You can see it in her eyes." Cold. Silas set his glass down. The sound was soft, but his hand was tight around the glass. He knew that tone. He had heard it 5 years ago, echoing off the canyon walls of his own life. Killer. Cold-blooded. Should have hanged. He hadn't hanged. It had been self-defense, or near enough as made no difference to the law. But the town had convicted him in the court of public opinion long before the judge banged his gavel. He looked at the men, their faces flushed with the excitement of destroying a woman they had never spoken to. Silas finished his drink in one swallow. It tasted like ash. He tossed a coin onto the wood and walked out, the bat-wing doors swinging shut behind him. He didn't know Nora Vance. Maybe she had poisoned a man. Maybe she had stolen diamonds. But seeing her yesterday, shaking in the dust while Jeb Gable laughed at her, he didn't see a predator. He saw prey. 2 days later, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind had been picking up all morning, rattling the window panes of the boarding house and sending tumbleweeds skittering down the main street like frightened animals. By 4 o'clock, the air was yellow and thick. Nora was in the kitchen, her hands red and raw from scrubbing the floor with lye soap. "Mrs." Hatcher stormed in, her face pinched. "The water barrel is low." She snapped. "Go to the pump, now, before the storm breaks, and don't dawdle." Nora wiped her hands on her apron, grabbed 2 heavy tin buckets, and hurried out the back door. The wind hit her instantly, snatching the breath from her lungs. It was hot wind, dry and gritty, carrying the taste of ozone. The town pump was 2 blocks away, near the livery. Nora kept her head down, fighting against the gale that whipped her skirts around her legs and tore strands of hair from her pins. The sky was darkening rapidly, a wall of brown dust advancing from the north, swallowing the mountains, then the foothills, then the edge of town. She reached the pump and hung the first bucket on the hook. She had to use her entire body weight to work the handle. The water sputtered, then flowed. She filled the first bucket, then the second. As she lifted them, the storm hit. It wasn't rain. It was earth. A wall of sand and grit slammed into the town with a roar like a freight train. Visibility dropped to 0 in a heartbeat. The world became a swirling vortex of brown chaos. Nora gasped, and the grit coated her tongue. She stumbled, the wind nearly knocking her off her feet. One bucket swung wildly, water splashing over her boots, turning the dust to mud instantly. She couldn't see the boarding house. She couldn't see the livery. She was blind, lost in a sea of stinging sand that cut her skin like tiny knives. She took a step and tripped over a rut, falling hard to her knees. Panic flared, white-hot and primal. She tried to stand, but the wind shoved her back down. Suddenly, a shape loomed out of the brown haze, a horse, huge and terrified, rearing up, a man's voice, shouting, "Whoa, easy!" A hand grabbed Nora's arm. It was a grip like iron. She was hauled upward, pulled against a solid wall of coat and muscle. "Get down!" the voice roared over the wind. "Silas!" He didn't ask if she was all right. There was no time. He dragged her toward the side of the livery stable, where a heavy freight wagon was parked. He shoved her into the narrow space between the wagon's wheels and the wall of the stable, then crowded in after her, pulling his horse as close as he dared to block the wind. The space was cramped, dim, and smelled of axle grease and horse sweat. Silas pressed Nora back against the rough wood of the stable wall, shielding her with his own body. He stood with his back to the storm, his coat collar turned up, taking the brunt of the lashing sand. Nora was shaking violently. It wasn't just the cold dropping with the wind. It was the adrenaline. She was pressed into the corner, and Silas was inches from her. His arms were bracketed on either side of her head, bracing himself against the wall. He looked down at her. His hat was pulled low, coated in dust, but his eyes were visible in the gloom. They were calm, anchors in the chaos. "Stay still," he said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "It will pass." Nora nodded, her teeth chattering. She was acutely aware of his proximity. In the boarding house, in the town, she shrank from men. She feared their size, their smell, their sudden movements. But here, with the world trying to scour the skin from her bones, his size was a shelter. The wind howled, a demonic shriek that vibrated in her chest. A piece of debris, a shingle or a branch, slammed into the wagon wheel with a crack like a gunshot. Nora flinched, a small cry escaping her throat. Silas moved closer, eliminating the last inch of space between them. He didn't touch her inappropriately, but his chest brushed hers as he leaned in to protect her from the ricocheting grit. His hands moved from the wall to her upper arms, gripping her firmly, steadying her. "I've got you," he said. "It's all right." For a moment, time suspended. The storm raged inches away, but in the small pocket of air between them, there was a sudden, terrifying intimacy. Nora could smell the tobacco smoke on his coat, the scent of rain-soaked sage, the warmth of his skin. She looked up at him, her face streaked with dust and tears. He looked back. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then snapped back to her eyes. He didn't mock her. He didn't leer. He looked at her with a strange, grave intensity, as if he were seeing the fear in her and recognizing it as his own. Nora felt a jolt go through her, not fear, but something sharper, attraction. It terrified her more than the storm. She had thought that part of her was dead, killed by Thomas's fists. To feel it now, for a man she barely knew, a man the town whispered was a killer, felt dangerous. But she didn't push him away. She leaned into his grip, just a fraction, borrowing his strength because she had none left of her own. They stood like that for 20 minutes, until the roar of the wind subsided to a moan and the brown air began to thin. Silas stepped back slowly, giving her space. He brushed the sand from his sleeves, his face returning to its mask of stoicism. "It's breaking up," he said. Nora nodded, unable to speak. She felt cold without his heat blocking the wind. He took the reins of his horse and led the way out. The town was coated in a layer of brown drift. The air was still thick, but the sun was trying to push through, casting an eerie, orange light over the devastation. "Come on," Silas said. "I'll walk you back." They walked in silence. Nora's buckets were gone, lost in the wind. She didn't care. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Hatcher was standing in the doorway, a broom in her hand. She looked at Nora, disheveled and dirty, and then at Silas, looming dark and tall beside her. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "You lost the buckets." "Mrs." Hatcher said flatly. "That's 50 cents out of your wages. The storm," Nora stammered. Silas stepped forward. His shadow fell over the widow. "The storm took them. Mrs. Hatcher, unless you expected her to hold on to tin in a 60-mile gale. Mrs. Hatcher bristled, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and disdain. "This is none of your affair. Mr. Thorne." Silas looked at her for a long moment, until the widow looked away. Then he turned to Nora. He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Vance, thank you," Nora murmured. She felt the widow's eyes burning into her. She pulled away from Silas, stepping quickly onto the porch, putting the barrier of respectability between them. Silas didn't move immediately. He stood by his horse, watching her. Nora paused at the door and looked back. He was watching her with a lingering, heavy gaze. It wasn't the look of a predator. It was the look of a man who had seen a fellow exile in the dark and wasn't sure if he should be glad or sorry for it. He turned the roan and walked away into the settling dust. Nora went inside, into the house of rules and judgment, and closed the door. The days that followed Nora Vance's arrival in Bitter Creek were measured not in hours, but in the ache of her muscles and the redness of her hands. The romantic notion of the West, of wide skies and freedom, stopped abruptly at the threshold of Mrs. Hatcher's boarding house. Here, time was a cycle of drudgery. It began in the pre-dawn dark, when the air in the attic room was still cold enough to turn breath into mist. Nora would rise, shivering, to break the ice on the wash basin before descending to the kitchen. The wood stove was a temperamental beast of iron that demanded constant feeding. And if the biscuits were brown on the bottom rather than golden, Mrs. Hatcher took it as a personal insult. The floors were the worst of it. They were rough pine, scarred by the boots of miners and drifters, and they drank water and lye soap with a thirst that could not be quenched. Nora spent half her life on her knees, scrubbing until the skin on her knuckles cracked and bled, stinging sharply every time she plunged her hands back into the gray, sudsy water. The town of Bitter Creek did not soften toward her. If anything, the silence grew louder. When she swept the front porch, men passing by would tip their hats with an exaggerated, mocking courtesy, their eyes raking over her figure as if estimating her price. The women were worse. They did not look at her at all. They looked through her, as if she were a ghost haunting the edges of their respectable lives. At the mercantile, when she went to fetch flour or coffee, conversations would die the moment the bell above the door jingled. Silence would stretch out, heavy and suffocating, until she placed her order. Mrs. Gable would slide the goods across the counter with 2 fingers, taking the coin without touching Nora's skin, dropping it into the till as if it were tainted. Nora learned to walk with her gaze fixed on the middle distance. Seeing everything but acknowledging nothing, she built a wall around herself, brick by brick, mortared with silence and shame. Sunday arrived with a relentless, blinding sun. Church was not optional. Mrs. Hatcher had made that clear. To miss service was to admit guilt, to confirm that one was too sinful to sit in the house of the Lord. The church was stifling. The air inside was thick with the smell of wool suits, lavender water, and unwashed bodies. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the plain glass windows. Nora sat in the very last pew, squeezed into the corner, clutching her hymnal like a shield. The Reverend Miller droned on about the fires of damnation and the purity of the Spirit, his voice rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. Nora tuned him out, her eyes tracing the grain of the wood in the pew in front of her. Then the door opened. It was late. 20 minutes into the sermon. Heads turned. A ripple of disapproval went through the congregation. Silas Thorne stepped inside. He had removed his hat, holding it by the brim in hands that were dark with sun and work. His hair was damp, slicked back in an attempt at order, but unruly strands curled behind his ears. He wore a clean shirt, though the collar was frayed, and a black coat that had seen better years. His boots were polished, but the dust of the ride had already coated them in a fine, gray powder. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. He did not look apologetic. He looked like a wolf who had wandered into a kennel of house dogs. Watchful, dangerous, and entirely out of place. He moved toward the back pew, the only place where there was room. As he sat down, the family occupying the other end, the Millers, shifted. It was a subtle movement, a sliding of hips and a rustling of skirts, moving 6 inches to the left, putting clear air between themselves and the rancher. Silas did not react. He stared straight ahead at the pulpit, his face a mask of stone. Nora felt a sudden sharp pang in her chest. She recognized that stillness. She knew what it cost to sit in a room full of people who wished you were elsewhere, to feel the weight of their judgment pressing against your skin like a physical touch. She glanced sideways at him. He was staring at the preacher, but the muscle in his jaw was jumping. For the rest of the service, Nora did not hear a word of the sermon. She was acutely aware of the man sitting 4 feet away, separated from her by the empty space the town demanded. When the service ended, the congregation spilled out onto the wooden steps, desperate for fresh air and the release of gossip. Nora tried to slip away, intending to hurry back to the boarding house before anyone could accost her. But Mrs. Hatcher gripped her elbow. "Wait here," the widow hissed. "I need to speak with Mrs. Gable about the altar cloths. Do not wander." Nora stood by the railing. Trapped. A group of 4 women, including Mrs. Gable and the banker's wife, Mrs. Higgins, gathered nearby. They formed a tight circle of bonnets and bustles, their voices pitched just loud enough to carry. "I declare," Mrs. Higgins said, fanning herself vigorously. "The audacity of some people, walking in late, disturbing the sanctity of the message. And look who he sat near, Mrs. Gable murmured, casting a sidelong glance at Nora. "Birds of a feather, Mrs." Higgins sniffed. "It is a disgrace she is even allowed in the door. I received a letter from my cousin in Denver just last week. She says she heard about a woman fitting her description working the upstairs rooms at the Golden Slipper Saloon. Can you imagine?" A cold numbness spread through Nora's limbs. She had never been to Denver. She had never set foot in a saloon until she walked past the one in this town. But the lie was so specific, so colorful, that she knew it would stick. Once a woman was branded a whore, every movement she made was interpreted as seduction, every silence as guilt. She stared at her hands, gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. "Do not cry," she told herself. "Do not give them the satisfaction." "Well, Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy, "one cannot expect a leopard to change its spots. Once a woman sells her virtue, she forgets the value of it. Excuse me, ladies." The voice was low, calm, and laced with iron. The circle of women broke apart as if struck by lightning. Silas Thorne stood on the bottom step, looking up at them. He had put his hat back on, the brim shading his eyes, but his mouth was set in a hard line. "Silas!" "Mrs." Gable stammered, clutching her throat. "You startled us. I could hear you from the street," Silas said. He ascended 1 step, bringing him eye level with the group. "You seem to know a great deal about the Golden Slipper Saloon." "Mrs. Higgins, Mrs." Higgins flushed a deep, violent crimson. I most certainly do not. I was merely repeating what—" "To know the layout of the upstairs rooms," Silas continued, his voice mild but his gaze cutting. "One would have to spend a fair amount of time there, or perhaps your husband has described it to you." "Mrs." Higgins gasped, looking as though she might faint. The other women stood frozen, their mouths agape. In polite society, one did not speak of such things directly. One hinted, one whispered. Silas had just torn down the curtain of their propriety with a single sentence. "If you have proof of a crime, take it to the sheriff," Silas said quietly. "If you are just chewing on rumors because you are hungry for someone else's misery, I suggest you do it quietly. It is Sunday, after all." He did not wait for a response. He tipped his hat, a gesture that looked more like a dismissal than a courtesy, and turned away. He walked past Nora. He did not stop, and he did not smile. But for a split second, his eyes met hers. There was no pity in them, Only a shared grimness, an acknowledgement that they were both standing on the wrong side of the line. Nora felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a mix of mortifying shame that he had heard the insults, and a fierce, terrifying gratitude that nearly brought her to her knees. The weeks bled into a month. The heat of summer began to settle over the territory, baking the earth until it cracked. Nora's reputation, once merely tarnished, was now fully blackened by the soot of gossip. The incident at the church had not silenced the women. It had only made them more vicious. Now that they felt attacked, they blamed Nora for Silas's rudeness, as if she had bewitched him into speaking out of turn. Mrs. Hatcher, sensing the mood of the town, became more severe. On Friday, she called Nora into the parlor. "You broke a saucer yesterday," Mrs. Hatcher said, sitting behind her desk like a judge. "It was already cracked." "Ma'am," Nora said softly, "it came apart in the water. It was whole when I bought it. That is 10 cents. And the hallway was not swept properly on Tuesday. I found dust in the corner. That is another 10 cents. Nora watched as the widow tallied the deductions in a ledger. When her wages were finally pushed across the desk, the pile of coins was pitifully small, $2.80. Nora took the money back to her attic room. She sat on the edge of the cot and pried open the tin she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She added the coins to her savings and counted $12. A stagecoach ticket to California cost $40. At this rate, she would be an old woman before she could leave Bitter Creek. She stared at the coins, feeling the walls of the room closing in. She was not just trapped by the geography, she was trapped by the economics of her exile. On a Tuesday, when the air was thick with the smell of sage and dust, Mrs. Hatcher found Nora in the laundry yard. "Leave the sheets," the widow commanded. "A crate arrived at the freight office this morning. It was mixed in with my order of flour, but it belongs to Mr. Thorne." The clerk refused to separate the bill until it is delivered. "Mr. Thorne?" Nora asked, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "Yes, it is heavy, and I will not pay for a delivery boy. You will take the cart and walk it out to his place. It is 3 miles up the north road." "Walk?" Nora looked at the sun, high and white in the sky. "It will do you good to get some air," Mrs. Hatcher said, her lip curling slightly. "And perhaps you can explain to Mr. Thorne that I do not appreciate my supplies being delayed by his errands." Nora did not argue. To argue was to lose more money. She fetched the hand cart, a rickety wooden thing with mismatched wheels, and walked to the freight office. The crate was indeed heavy, a box of machinery parts or tools that strained her back as she levered it onto the cart. The freight clerk watched her struggle, picking his teeth, offering no help. She set off down the north road. The town fell away quickly, replaced by the stark, beautiful desolation of the range. The road was little more than 2 ruts worn into the hardpan. On either side, scrubby sagebrush stretched out to the horizon, silver green and pungent. A distant line of cottonwood trees marked the course of a creek, a ribbon of life in the brown landscape. The silence was absolute, broken only by the squeak of the cart's axle and the crunch of her boots. It was a relief. In a way, out here, there were no whispers, there were no eyes. She had been walking for an hour, her dress sticking to her back with sweat, when she heard the rhythm of hoofbeats approaching. She didn't look up, keeping her head down, pulling the cart like a mule. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. "Miss Vance!" She stopped and straightened, shielding her eyes against the glare. Silas Thorne sat atop his roan horse, looking down at her. He wore work clothes, denim trousers reinforced with leather, a faded blue shirt, and a red bandana loosely knotted around his neck. "Mr. Thorne," Nora said, breathless. He looked at the cart, then at the crate, then back at her. His brow furrowed. "Mrs. Hatcher has you pulling a wagon like an oxen. There was a mix-up at the freight office," Nora explained, trying to smooth her hair. "She sent me to bring this to you." Silas swore softly. It was a short, sharp word that made Nora flinch, though she knew it wasn't directed at her. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion. "Leave it," he said. "I have to deliver it. Nora said, "She insists. I mean, leave the cart. I will come back for it with the buckboard later." He walked over to the crate, tested its weight, and shook his head. "That woman has a heart like a dried prune. You are not walking 3 miles back in this heat." He turned to his horse. "Come on. I'm headed to the ranch. I'll take you the rest of the way, give you some water, and bring you back to town before dark." Nora hesitated. Her first instinct, honed by years of fear, was to refuse. To be seen riding alone with a man, out here, where anything could happen, was exactly the sort of scandal the town was waiting for. It would confirm every rumor. But she looked at the long, dusty road behind her. She looked at Silas. He wasn't looking at her with the predatory hunger she saw in the men on Main Street. He was looking at her with simple, practical concern. "It isn't proper," she said weakly. "Propriety never put water in a thirsty throat," Silas said. He unhooked a canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. "Drink." The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She handed it back, wiping her mouth. "Thank you." He moved to the horse, checking the cinch. "I don't have a side saddle. Can you ride?" I grew up on a farm in Ohio," she said, "but that was a long time ago." He nodded. He led the horse to a large flat rock by the roadside. "Step up here." Nora climbed onto the rock. Silas brought the horse alongside. He didn't grab her waist or manhandle her. He simply offered his forearm as a brace. She gripped it. His muscle was hard as wood beneath the sleeve, and seated herself sideways behind the saddle, hooking her knee around the cantle as best she could. It felt precarious. The horse shifted, and she gasped, clutching at Silas's shirt. "Hold on to me," he said, mounting smoothly in front of her. She placed her hands tentatively on his waist. The contact sent a shock through her fingertips. He was solid, warm, alive. It had been years since she had touched a man without fear of pain. They started forward at a walk. The motion was jarring at first, but she settled into it. After a mile, the terrain grew rougher, the road dipping into a dry wash filled with loose stones. "This isn't safe for side saddle," Silas called back. "You need to swing your leg over." "I can't," Nora said, mortified. "My skirts. Nobody out here but the Hawks, Miss Vance, and they don't care about your ankles. Swing your leg over. You'll fall otherwise." She swallowed her pride and did as he asked, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible. Straddling the horse felt wild, forbidden. She had to press her thighs against his hips to keep her balance. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," she admitted. He reached back with one hand, briefly resting it on her knee to steady her as the horse scrambled up the bank. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it burned through the fabric of her dress. "Hold tight," he said. As they crested the rise, the ranch came into view. It was not a grand estate. It was a testament to stubbornness. A small, whitewashed cabin sat in the shelter of a grove of cottonwoods. A creek, currently running low and clear, wound past a vegetable garden that looked half-scorched by the sun. A barn, half-finished, its ribs of new timber gleaming in the light, stood near a corral where 3 horses grazed. Fields stretched out beyond, showing the scars of drought, patches of brown amid the green, but the fences were straight, and the place had an air of cared-for dignity. "It's not much," Silas said, his voice dropping a register. "But it's mine. It's beautiful," Nora said, and she meant it. It looked like peace. They sat at the small pine table in his kitchen. The room was sparse, a stove, a shelf of books, a gun rack, a single bed in the corner made up with military precision. It smelled of coffee and cedar. Silas poured 2 mugs of black coffee from a pot on the stove. He set one before her and sat opposite, taking off his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Thank you for the church," Nora said suddenly. She hadn't meant to say it, but the silence demanded truth. He shrugged, looking into his cup. "I didn't do it for thanks. I just don't like bullies. And Mrs. Higgins is a bully in a silk bonnet. Why did you build this place?" she asked, gesturing to the window. "So far from everyone?" "Because I needed quiet," he said. He looked up at her, his eyes dark and unguarded. I lived a life before this that I'm not proud of. I carried a gun for money. I rode with men who didn't know the difference between right and easy. He paused, tracing the rim of his mug. When I left that life, I wanted to build something, to make something grow instead of watching things die. Nora nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? He asked. She took a breath. My husband, back east, he was a man who liked to own things. He thought he owned me. When he died, it was confusing circumstances. Confusing? Silas asked softly. He fell, she said, her voice trembling. Down the stairs, but he fell because I pushed him. He was choking me. It was him or me. Silas did not blink. He did not recoil. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. I killed a man once. He said, not in the war, in a card game in Abilene. He was drunk, drew on me. I shot him before he cleared leather. It was self-defense, the law said. But I see his face sometimes. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and vibrating. Two sinners, confessing their crimes over bitter coffee. Nora felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of kinship. They were both scarred people, trying to survive in a world that wanted them perfect. I don't think you're a bad man, Silas, she whispered. And I don't think you're a murderer, Nora, he replied. The use of her first name sounded like a caress. The air in the kitchen hummed with unspoken questions. The distance across the table seemed to shrink. A sudden crack of thunder shattered the mood. Nora jumped, spilling a drop of coffee. The room darkened instantly as a heavy cloud blocked the sun. Silas stood up and went to the window. Storm's blowing in fast, a real gully washer. We need to get the horses in. They hurried outside. The sky had turned a violent shade of purple. Lightning forked across the horizon, jagged and white. The wind whipped Nora's hair across her face. By the time they got the horses into the barn, the rain began. It didn't start slow. It fell in sheets, hammering the roof of the barn with a deafening roar. The smell of the world changed instantly, dust turning to mud, the sweet scent of wet hay, the pungent odor of horse sweat. They stood in the center of the barn, breathless. The doors were closed against the wind, leaving the space dim and intimate. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cracks in the walls, followed by a boom of thunder that shook the ground. Nora flinched violently, wrapping her arms around herself. She squeezed her eyes shut, and for a second, she wasn't in a barn in Wyoming. She was in the hallway in St. Louis, the storm raging outside, matching the rage in Thomas's eyes. She felt a weight settle over her shoulders. She opened her eyes. Silas was standing in front of her. He had taken off his canvas coat and draped it around her. It was heavy and warm, retaining the heat of his body. You're shaking, he said. I don't like storms, she whispered. He didn't laugh. He stepped closer, his hands lingering on the collar of the coat, his knuckles brushing the sensitive skin at the base of her neck. A shiver went down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. His face was shadowed, but his eyes caught the gray light filtering through the slats. They were intense, focused entirely on her. The barn felt like it was shrinking, the rest of the world falling away until there was only the sound of the rain and the sound of his breathing. They say a lot of things in town, Silas said, his voice low, barely audible over the rain. About you, about me. I know, she said. I don't believe them, he said. I look at you, Nora, and I don't see what they see. I see someone who's carrying a heavy load and still standing up straight. Nora looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. I know what it's like, he continued, his thumb grazing her jawline. A touch so light it was almost a ghost. To have your whole future weighed against one night you wish you could forget. To be defined by the worst thing that ever happened to you. Tears pricked Nora's eyes. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever looked at the wreckage of her past and seen the person underneath. Drawn by that gaze, by the aching understanding in it, she took a step closer. The movement was almost involuntary. Silas lowered his head. He gave her time to pull away. Time to run. She didn't. Their lips met. It was hesitant at first, a question asked and answered. His lips were rough, chapped from the wind, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He tasted of coffee and rain. Nora stood frozen for a heartbeat, stunned by the sensation. Then, a dam broke inside her. She let herself sink into it. She felt the solid, unyielding line of his chest against hers, the warmth of his large hands sliding down to cup her elbows, holding her up. For 5 seconds, she was not a widow, not a fugitive, not a servant. She was just a woman, alive and wanted. Then, the memory of Thomas's hands, grasping, hurting, slammed into her mind. Panic surged. She gasped and pulled away violently. Stumbling back, the coat slipped from her shoulders to the dirt floor. "I can't," she stammered, her hands flying to her mouth. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She backed away until she hit a stall door. "I ruin everything," she whispered frantically. "Everything I touch, it goes wrong. You don't want this. You don't want me." Silas didn't chase her. He stood where he was, his hands raised slightly, palms out. "Nora," he said. His voice was steady, anchoring her. "Look at me." She looked, trembling. "I am not him," Silas said. He knew, somehow, he knew exactly what ghost she was fighting. "I will never take more than you freely give. Not a kiss, not a touch, nothing." He picked up the coat and dusted it off, but he didn't try to put it back on her. He draped it over a sawhorse. "You don't ruin things," he said softly. "You're just scared, and you have a right to be." The intensity in the air didn't dissipate. It just changed frequency. It crackled beneath the surface like the distant lightning, electric and dangerous. The rain began to slacken, tapping against the roof rather than hammering. "Come on," Silas said, his voice rough. "I'll saddle the horses. I promise to get you back before dark." They rode back to town in the wet dusk. The earth smelled rich and new, washed clean by the storm. They didn't speak, but as Nora sat behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist, she felt the heat of him through his shirt, a constant, steady warmth in the cooling evening. She was terrified of what she felt, but for the first time in years, she wasn't terrified of the man she was feeling it for. The heat that settled over Bitter Creek in the weeks following the storm was not the cleansing fire of summer, but a stagnant, suffocating weight. The wheat harvest in the valley had come up thin and brittle. The kernels shriveled inside their husks, and the cattle on the range were growing lean, ribs pressing against hides dusty with drought. When the land turned mean, the people of Bitter Creek turned mean with it. Frustration needed a target, and since they could not shoot the sun for burning their crops, they looked for something closer to the ground. Nora Vance felt the change in the air as surely as a deer smells a shifting wind. She moved through the boarding house with a rigid, terrifying caution. Every time she walked down the main street, she felt the phantom pressure of Silas Thorne's lips on hers, a memory she kept locked in the deepest cellar of her mind. She was certain, with the paranoid logic of the guilty, that someone had seen them in the barn. She imagined eyes peering through the knotholes, ears pressed against the wet wood. Her guilt made her posture stiff. She held her head high, not out of pride, but to keep from crumbling. And the town, in its ignorance, mistook this bracing for arrogance. "Look at her," the whisperers said at the general store, "walking like she owns the pavement. You would think she was a queen, not a woman who scrubs floors for copper coins." Mrs. Hatcher, the widow who ran the boarding house, was the first to vocalize the darkening mood. She cornered Nora in the pantry one Tuesday morning, surrounded by sacks of weevil-ridden flour. "You are bringing attention to this house," Mrs. Hatcher said, her voice tight and low. "I have done nothing, ma'am," Nora replied, clutching a broom. "I do my work. I keep to myself." "It is the way you keep to yourself," the widow snapped. "And it is the way that rancher Thorne keeps finding reasons to linger when he is in town. I am a woman of reputation. Nora, I cannot afford to have the stain of your history, whatever it may truly be, seeping into my floorboards. If there is even a scent of scandal, one word, one look, you will be on the street. Do you understand?" "I understand," Nora whispered. Her stomach knotted. She had nowhere else to go. Her savings were still pitilessly low, barely enough to buy a ticket to the next county, let alone safety. Silas, to his credit, seemed to sense the tightening noose. He kept his distance in public. He did not tip his hat when he passed her on the street. He barely nodded. But the town was small, and secrets were hard to keep. A sack of high-grade flour appeared on the back porch of the boarding house one morning, marked paid in a heavy, angular hand. Mrs. Hatcher assumed it was a mistake by the freighter. But Nora knew better. Later that week, when she went to the livery to pay the boarding house's bill for firewood hauling, the stablemaster grunted that a portion of it had already been covered by a friend. Nora's heart sank, even as it fluttered. He was trying to help. He was trying to ease the burden that was grinding her down. But every coin he spent on her was another thread binding them together in the eyes of a town that was watching for the knot to tighten. The blow fell on a Thursday evening. Nora was clearing the table in the dining room, stacking plates thick with grease and gravy. The window faced the main street, offering a view of the livery and the hotel. A rider turned onto the street. He did not ride like a local. He sat his horse with an upright, rigid posture, his heels down, his reins held high. He wore a coat of fine gray wool, dusty from the road but unmistakably expensive, and a bowler hat that marked him as a man of the East. Nora glanced out, distracted, and the plate in her hand slipped. It hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot, shattering into a dozen sharp white shards. The room went silent. The three miners eating at the far end of the table looked up. Mrs. Hatcher appeared in the doorway, her face purple with rage. "Clumsy girl! That is imported china!" Nora did not hear her. She was gripping the windowsill, her fingernails digging into the wood until they bent. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the milk pitcher. The man on the horse was Arthur Vance. He was her late husband's brother, the man who had sat in her parlor in St. Louis, drinking Thomas's brandy, watching her with eyes that were too wet and too knowing. The man who, on the night Thomas died at the bottom of the stairs, had stood over the body and smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I can take care of things, Nora," he had said, the scent of bay rum and decay clinging to him. "But silence has a price, and you have always been a woman who needs guidance." She had run that very night. She had thought 500 miles of wilderness was enough. She had been wrong. He dismounted in front of the hotel, handing his reins to a stable boy with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He carried a leather satchel, bulging with papers. He paused on the boardwalk, slapping the dust from his coat, and looked up and down the street. His expression was one of smug ownership, a predator surveying a new hunting ground. Nora sank to her knees among the broken china, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had found her. Arthur Vance did not come for her immediately. He was a man who understood that the hunt was more effective when the trap was laid with care. He spent the next 2 days threading his way through the social fabric of Bitter Creek. He was a chameleon, shedding his city arrogance when necessary to adopt a tone of mournful respectability. He sat in the barber chair, speaking loudly enough for the mayor to hear. "It is a tragedy. Truly," Arthur said, his voice thick with fabricated grief. "My poor brother. Thomas was a saint of a man, worked himself to the bone to provide for her. And how did she repay him? With coldness, with demands. And finally, well, I suspect she drove him to the bottle just to weaken him. He visited the preacher, bowing his head in the pews. I searched for her not out of vengeance, Reverend, but out of a desire for closure. She fled with money that belonged to the family estate, money meant for Thomas's creditors. She left a mountain of debt and a grieving family. And the way Thomas died, falling down those stairs. The coroner was suspicious, but she was gone before the inquiry could begin. He drank at the saloon, buying rounds for the men, shaking his head sorrowfully. She is a manipulator, gentleman, a siren. She plays the victim, acts the frightened bird, but underneath, ice. She seduced Thomas, drained him dry, and when he was no longer useful, snap. The town, already predisposed to dislike the sullen, silent woman at the boarding house, drank down his poison like sweet wine. It confirmed everything they wanted to believe. It gave them a reason for their hatred. She's a murderess. The whispers became declarations. Did you hear? She pushed him. She poisoned him first, then pushed him. She stole $1,000, maybe more. She'll do it again. A woman like that doesn't change. Nora felt the eyes on her turn from cold to murderous. When she walked to the pump, mothers pulled their children behind their skirts. Men spat in the dust as she passed. It was no longer just judgment. It was the prelude to violence. On Saturday morning, the law came knocking. Sheriff Brady was a man of limited imagination and heavy fists. He stood in the hallway of the boarding house, filling the space with his bulk. Mrs. Hatcher stood behind him, wringing her hands, looking terrified and vindicated all at once. Nora Vance, the sheriff rumbled. Yes, Sheriff. Nora wiped her hands on her apron. She was shaking, but she forced her feet to stay planted. I have a complaint lodged against you, and I have evidence. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. He held it up, but did not let her take it. It was a promissory note, dated 6 months ago, bearing a signature that looked like hers but curled with a flourish she never used. This here document says you admitted to owing the Vance estate $400. And we have a witness statement regarding the death of Thomas Vance. It is a lie, Nora said, her voice cracking. I never signed that, and Thomas attacked me. It was self-defense, the sheriff snorted. Self-defense? A little thing like you against a grown man, and then you run away. Innocent people don't run. Miss Vance, innocent people don't hide in the attic of a boarding house in the middle of nowhere. Arthur Vance, he is twisting it, Nora pleaded. He wanted me to— Save it for the judge, the sheriff interrupted, though I doubt it will get that far. Mr. Vance is a reasonable man. He wants his money, or he wants you to return east to face the music. I won't go back with him, Nora whispered. I would rather die. The front door opened. The morning light flooded the dark hallway, silhouetting a tall figure. Silas Thorne stepped inside. He did not look at Nora. He looked straight at the sheriff. Is there a problem here, Brady? Silas asked. His voice was low, resting on the edge of a growl. Sheriff Brady turned, his hand dropping instinctively to his belt. Thorne. This is official business. Doesn't concern you. It concerns me when I hear a woman being badgered in her own home. Silas said. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his boots. She's a fugitive, the sheriff spat. A murderess. If the brother is to be believed, since when do you take the word of a stranger in a fancy coat over the word of a woman who's been scrubbing floors in your town for 2 months? Silas asked. Since that stranger has papers, Brady retorted. And since that woman has a history, we all have a history. Brady, Silas said. His eyes were hard as flint. You didn't seem to mind mine when I brought in those cattle rustlers last winter. You didn't mind mine when I put money into the town coffers. That was different, the sheriff snapped, his face reddening. You killed a man in a fair fight. This is a domestic matter. It's dirty. Different, Silas repeated, the word dripping with bitterness. Because I'm a man, or because I'm useful to you, you tread carefully. Thorne, the sheriff warned, stepping into Silas's space. You're on thin ice in this town as it is. Don't think your gun buys you a seat at the table. You defend this woman. You paint yourself with the same brush. Silas didn't blink. Maybe I don't like the color of your paint. Sheriff. The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, the sheriff stepped back, adjusting his belt. I'm giving you a warning. Miss Vance, he said, ignoring Silas. You settle this with Mr. Vance, or I lock you up until the circuit judge comes through in September. And our jail, it ain't built for ladies. He turned and shouldered past Silas, storming out into the street. Silas turned to Nora. She was leaning against the wall, looking as if her legs had turned to water. Are you all right? He asked. He's here, she whispered. Arthur, he's here. I know, Silas said. I saw him. Mrs. Hatcher cleared her throat. She had been watching from the parlor door. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "You have to go," she said to Nora. "Mrs. Hatcher," Nora began. "No," the widow cut her off, her voice shaking. "The sheriff, the law. I cannot have this. I cannot have the police at my door. I run a respectable house." She looked at Nora, and for a second, the mask slipped. There was pity in her eyes, a terrified, helpless sort of pity. "I'm sorry, Nora, truly, but you must be out by tonight. I cannot protect you." Nora looked at the woman and saw her own fear reflected back. She nodded slowly. "I will pack," she said. Nora packed her carpet bag in the stifling heat of the attic. It didn't take long. She had nothing. When she came downstairs, the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the town. Silas was gone. He had left after the sheriff, presumably to return to his ranch. She was alone. Panic began to rise in her chest, a cold tide. She could not just walk out into the sagebrush. The coyotes would have her before dawn. She had no money for the stage. She had no allies. She had only one card left to play. She had to speak to Arthur. Perhaps, she reasoned with the desperate logic of the trapped, she could bargain with him. Perhaps she could give him the few dollars she had. Promise to vanish further west, beg him to leave her be. It was a fool's hope, but it was all she had. She knew where he would be. He was a man of habits. She slipped out the back door and made her way through the alleyways toward the saloon. The sound of a piano and drunken laughter drifted into the cooling air. She didn't go in. She went around the back, where the smell of stale beer and rotting garbage hung heavy. She waited in the shadows of the woodpile. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, the back door opened, casting a wedge of yellow light into the dirt. Arthur Vance stepped out, lighting a cigar. The flame illuminated his face, smooth, handsome, and cruel. "Arthur," Nora whispered. Stepping into the light, he turned slowly. He didn't look surprised. He smiled, a slow spreading of lips that showed his teeth. "Nora," he said, "I wondered how long it would take. You always were predictable. Please, Arthur," she said, keeping her distance, "just tell me what you want." "What do I want?" He took a drag at the cigar, blowing the smoke toward her. "I want justice. Nora, I want the money you stole. I took $40, she said, my own money, from my sewing. You took the dignity of the Vance name," he corrected. "You left my brother dead at the bottom of the stairs and ran away like a common thief." "He hit me," Nora said, her voice rising. "He was going to kill me." Arthur laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "Thomas was a passionate man. You just didn't know how to handle him. You were always so brittle." He took a step toward her. She took a step back, hitting the rough wood of the saloon wall. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Do?" Arthur shrugged. "I'm going to watch you break. Nora, the sheriff is in my pocket. The town thinks you're a monster. I'm going to offer you a choice. You can come back east with me. Quietly. I have arrangements for women in your position. Asylums where they teach obedience. Or I leave you here, and I make sure every man in this territory knows exactly what you are. You'll starve, Nora, or you'll do what you have to do to survive, and then you'll really be what I say you are." He moved fast, before she could run. He closed the distance, his hand shooting out to grip her upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh, painful and possessive. "You're helpless." "Nora," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You were helpless in St. Louis, and you're helpless now." "Let go of me," she cried, struggling. "Take your hands off her." The voice came from the darkness of the alley mouth. It was not loud, but it stopped the world dead on its axis. Arthur froze. He looked up, peering into the shadows. "Who's there?" Silas Thorne stepped into the light. He was not wearing his work coat. He was wearing his gun belt, the leather worn and dark, tied low on his thigh. His hand hung loose by his side, inches from the walnut grip of his revolver. "I said, 'Let her go,'" Silas repeated. Arthur sneered, though he did not release Nora. "Ah, the cowboy, the one who thinks he's a knight in shining armor. I've heard about you. Thorne, the town drunk told me all about your incident." Arthur laughed. A killer defending a killer. It's almost poetic. He tightened his grip on Nora, making her wince. You have no business here, cowpuncher. This is a family matter. It became my business when you put your hands on her, Silas said. He took another step. The distance between them was now 10 feet. Arthur's eyes flicked to Silas's gun, then back to his face. He saw something there that made his smile falter. He saw the cold, dead calm of a man who had crossed the line before and was willing to do it again. You wouldn't dare, Arthur said, but his voice lacked conviction. In front of witnesses. Silas didn't answer. He just watched Arthur's hand on Nora's arm. Rage surged in Silas. It wasn't the hot, blinding rage of a bar fight. It was a cold, focused fury. He hated this man. He hated his clothes, his cigar, his arrogance. He hated him for making Nora tremble. His fingers twitched. He could draw. He could put a bullet in Arthur Vance's shoulder, or his heart, before the man could blink. It would be easy. Nora saw the shift in Silas's eyes. She saw the darkness rising up in him, the same darkness he had told her about in the barn. No! She screamed. She wrenched her arm free, ignoring the pain, and threw herself not away from the danger, but between the men. She stood in front of Arthur, facing Silas, her hands raised. Silas, no, don't! Move, Nora, Silas said, his voice flat. No! She took a step toward him. He wants you to do it. Don't you see? If you shoot him, they'll hang you. They're waiting for a reason. Please, Silas. Not for me. He isn't worth it. Silas looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. She was protecting him. She, who had nothing, was standing between him and ruin. The tension held for a long, agonizing second. Then, slowly, the tension drained from Silas's shoulders. He moved his hand away from his gun. Arthur, seeing the danger pass, regained his composure. He straightened his coat, chuckling nervously. Touching scene, he mocked. Truly, but it changes nothing. He looked at Nora with cold, dead eyes. You have until tomorrow. Nora, then the sheriff comes for you. And you, Thorne. I'll be speaking to the Cattle Association about the kind of company you keep. Arthur turned and walked back into the saloon, the door slamming behind him. They stood alone in the alley. The smell of garbage was overpowering, but Nora could only smell the gun oil on Silas. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Silas reached out and took her by the shoulders. This time, his grip was gentle, grounding. You shouldn't have stopped me, he said roughly. Yes, I should have, she whispered. One dead man is enough for both of us. He looked at her, and the hardness in his face broke. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been fighting a losing battle for a very long time. He looked up at the boarding house, then back at her. You can't stay there, he said. I know. She kicked me out. And you can't stay in town. Arthur will have Brady arrest you by noon tomorrow. I know, she repeated. Tears began to spill down her dusty cheeks. I don't know what to do. Silas, I have $12. I have nowhere to go. Silas took a breath. He looked down the alley, toward the open range, then looked her square in the eye. Come with me. Nora blinked. What? To the ranch. He said, Silas. Nora pulled back slightly. You know what they will say if I live there, with you, unmarried. I know. He cut her off. They will call you a whore. They will call me a fool. They will stop buying my beef in town. The preacher will condemn us from the pulpit. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't offer her a fairy tale. He offered her the brutal truth. It won't be respectable. Nora, it won't be easy, but it's a roof. It's a rifle. And it's me standing between you and him. Nora looked at him. She saw the stubble on his jaw, the dust in the creases of his coat, the stubborn set of his mouth. She saw a man who was offering to burn down his own reputation just to keep her warm. It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It wasn't a declaration of undying romance. It was an offer of asylum. But in his eyes, gray and steady as the winter sky, she saw something else. She saw yearning. She saw a quiet, desperate reverence that terrified and thrilled her. I will bring you nothing but trouble, she whispered. "I've got plenty of trouble already," he said. "I can handle a little more." She hesitated. The town was behind her, full of lights and judgment and Arthur Vance. The darkness of the range lay ahead. "Okay," she said. They rode out 10 minutes later. Nora sat behind him on the roan, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. Her carpet bag was tied to the saddle horn. As they passed the church, the bell began to toll the hour. It was a mournful, hollow sound. People came out onto their porches to watch them pass. Silas did not look left or right. He kept the horse at a steady walk, right down the center of the main street. It was a defiant parade of two. Nora saw Mrs. Gable standing on the boardwalk, her arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "See," her expression said, "I told you she was a fallen woman." Nora saw the sheriff watching from the jailhouse window. She buried her face in the back of Silas's coat. She inhaled the scent of him, tobacco, horse, and rain. They left the town behind. The road turned to dirt, then to track. The darkness of the prairie swallowed them. The air grew cooler, cleaner. The land around them stretched wide and unforgiving. The coyotes began to sing their jagged songs. It was a dangerous world. They were outcasts now, truly and completely. But as the horse found its rhythm, carrying them toward the small cabin by the creek, Nora felt a strange sensation blooming in her chest. It wasn't safety. Safety was a lie she had stopped believing in. It was something stronger. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running away from something. She was riding towards something. And the man holding the reins would kill for her. And she, God help her, would kill for him. She tightened her arms around him. Silas covered her hands with one of his. Squeezing tight, they rode on into the night, together. The silence of the Thorn Ranch was different from the silence of the boarding house attic. In town, silence was a held breath, a pause between judgments, heavy with the weight of what was not being said. Out here, amidst the rolling sage and the wide, indifferent sky, silence was a living thing. It was the wind combing through the dry grass, the distant lowing of a heifer separated from the herd, the rhythmic creak of the windmill turning lazily in the heat. For Nora Vance, this silence was the first medicine she had tasted in years. Life at the ranch was hard. It was a hardness that stripped away the pretenses of civilization and left only the bone and muscle of survival. There were no social calls, no starched collars, no whispers behind gloved hands. There was only the work. Nora threw herself into it with a desperation that bordered on religious fervor. She woke before the sun. In the small bedroom Silas had insisted she take, and listened to the rooster crowing from the coop near the creek. By the time the coffee was boiling on the cast-iron stove, she was already outside, feeding the chickens, scattering the cracked corn with hands that were rapidly losing their softness. The water was the hardest task. The creek was 100 yards from the house, down a sloping bank that turned slick with mud after a rain. She carried 2 galvanized buckets, the wire handles digging into her palms, the water sloshing against her skirts. Her shoulders burned, and her back ached with a dull, throbbing constant. But she welcomed the pain. The physical exhaustion was a shield. When she was too tired to think, she was too tired to remember. Silas watched her. He did not hover, and he did not coddle her. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that dignity lay in capability. When she struggled to lift a heavy rail to mend a section of the corral fence, he did not rush to take it from her. He simply stepped up beside her, took one end, and nodded. "Lift on 3, he would say. 1, 2, 3. They worked in tandem. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the way the day expanded and contracted with the light. She learned to discern the mood of the cattle by the set of their ears. She learned that a north wind meant a drop in temperature, and a stillness at noon meant a storm was building over the mountains. The rough labor steadied her. In town, she was a story, a scandal, a rumor, a collection of sins real and imagined. Here, sweating under the high sun, driving nails into cedar posts, she was simply a force of motion. She was useful. She was alive. And for the first time since she had left her father's farm in Ohio a lifetime ago, she felt the ground solid beneath her feet. The house, however, was a different matter. It was a small cabin, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud and straw. It consisted of a main room that served as kitchen and parlor, and a single bedroom built off the back. On the first night, Silas had carried her carpetbag into the bedroom and set it on the quilt. "You sleep here," he said. "The door has a bolt on the inside. You can use it." "Where will you sleep?" Nora had asked, looking at the narrow confines of the main room. Silas had gestured to a canvas cot folded in the corner, by the stove. "It is warm, and I'm used to hard beds." The arrangement was practical, but the intimacy of the space was inescapable. The walls were thin. At night, after the lantern was extinguished and the darkness pressed against the windows, the house seemed to shrink. Nora lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. She could hear the rustle of canvas as Silas turned on the cot. She could hear the soft scrape of a match when he lit a sleepless pipe. She could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing when he finally drifted off. She knew he was awake as often as she was. The air between the bedroom and the main room hummed with a tension that was not quite fear and not quite comfort. It was an awareness, sharp and electric. They were a man and a woman, stripped of society's protections, living in a proximity that defied every rule they had been raised to obey. Yet, he never crossed the threshold. He never tested the handle of her door. The bolt, she realized after the third night, was unnecessary. His honor was a stronger lock than any piece of iron. Their days settled into an uneasy, functional rhythm. As the weeks passed, the awkwardness of their flight from town began to callous over, replaced by a partnership forged in necessity. Silas took it upon himself to teach her the skills she needed to survive out here. It was not enough to be a housekeeper. On a ranch, everyone had to be a hand. He taught her to ride astride. The side saddle was abandoned, deemed dangerous and impractical for the rough terrain of the foothills. Nora felt a deep, burning shame the first time she hitched up her skirts and swung her leg over the saddle of the gentle mare he had assigned to her. It felt unladylike, exposed. Silas did not look away, but he did not ogle. He adjusted the stirrups with professional detachment. "Knees tight," he instructed, tapping her leg. "Balance comes from your core, not your hands. If you pull on the reins to stay on, you will hurt the horse's mouth." He taught her to shoot. He set up tin cans on a fence post 50 yards from the house. He handed her the heavy Winchester rifle, the wood stock warm from the sun. "Hold it tight against your shoulder," he said, standing behind her. "If you hold it loose, it will kick you like a mule." The first time she fired, the recoil staggered her, and the bullet went wide, kicking up a spray of dirt 10 feet to the left. Her shoulder throbbed. "Again," Silas said calmly. By the end of the week, she could hit the can 3 times out of 5. There was a grim satisfaction in the sound of the bullet punching through metal. It made her feel less like prey. In return, Nora brought order to his chaotic bachelor existence. She took his shirts, which were missing buttons and torn at the seams, and mended them by the light of the fire. She took the meager supplies in the pantry, dried beans, salted pork, flour, and turned them into meals that were actually edible. She even tried to teach him to cook one evening, when her hands were cramping from the laundry. "It is simple," she said, watching him frown at a pot of stew. "You cannot just throw everything in at once. The onions need to brown first." Silas stirred the pot with the grim determination of a man digging a post hole. "Cooking is chemistry," he grumbled. "I was never good at school." When he served the stew an hour later, the potatoes were raw in the middle, and the meat was tough as leather. He took a bite, chewed methodically for a long minute, and then looked at her. "I think," he said, his face deadpan, "that the coyotes might not even eat this." Nora laughed. It was a small sound, rusty and startled, but it broke the tension in the room like a hammer shattering glass. Silas watched her, the corners of his eyes crinkling. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was the first time she had felt light enough to do it. But the darkness was never far away. It waited in the corners of the room. in the shadows of the barn, and most of all, in the landscape of their dreams. It happened 3 weeks after she arrived. Nora was asleep, dreaming of the house in St. Louis. In the dream, the hallway was endless, stretching out like a tunnel. At the end of it, Thomas stood at the top of the stairs. He was not dead. He was very much alive, his face flushed with brandy and rage, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards as he came toward her. "You can't hide! Nora!" he roared. "You belong to me!" She tried to run, but her feet were stuck in the rug. He reached out, his hands massive, blotting out the light. He grabbed her throat. She couldn't breathe. The air turned to water. Nora woke with a gasp that tore at her throat. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her skin was cold and clammy with sweat. The room was pitch black. She scrambled out of bed, her breath coming in short, panicked hitches. She needed light. She needed to know she wasn't back there. She stumbled into the main room. The lantern on the table was turned low, casting a pool of golden light against the darkness. Silas was sitting there. He was fully dressed, save for his boots, a tin cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up as she burst in. "Nora?" She stood in the doorway, clutching her thin nightdress around her, her chest heaving. I... She couldn't get the words out. The terror of the dream was still wrapping its fingers around her windpipe. Silas set the cup down. He didn't rush her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just waited, his presence a solid anchor in the spinning room. "I saw him," she whispered. Silas nodded slowly. "The husband?" She nodded, tears spilling over. She walked to the table, her legs trembling so hard she could barely stand. She sank into the chair opposite him. He poured a splash of whiskey from a bottle into his coffee cup and pushed it toward her. "Drink." She took a sip. The liquor burned, but it cut through the panic. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said. The words came out in a rush. "A dam breaking. It was our anniversary. He bought me flowers, roses, but he was angry because the roast was dry. He started drinking. He always drank when things weren't perfect." Silas listened. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her face. "He hit me," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He had done it before, but that night, he said he was going to break my hands so I couldn't sew anymore. Sewing was the only thing that was mine, the only money I had." She looked at her hands, tracing the scars on her knuckles. "We were on the landing. He lunged at me. I pushed him. I didn't think. I just wanted him away from me. He fell backward. The sound, when his head hit the marble." She shuddered. "And then Arthur came. His brother. He found me standing over him. He didn't call the doctor. He didn't call the police. He just looked at me and smiled. He said he would handle it. He said if I ever spoke a word, if I ever tried to claim Thomas's money, he would see me hanged." She looked up at Silas, her eyes raw with shame. "I ran. I took the tin from under the floorboards and I ran. I left him there. I am a coward. Silas." Silas reached across the table. He took the cup from her hands and set it down. "You are not a coward," he said. "You are a survivor. There is a difference." He looked down at his own hands. Large, scarred, capable of violence. "I killed a man named Jim Miller," Silas said quietly. "He wasn't an enemy. He was a friend. We rode together for 2 years." Nora went still. "We were in Abilene," he went on, staring into the flame of the lantern. "We had been paid off for a drive. Jim drank too much whiskey. He got into an argument over a card game with a stranger. I tried to pull him away. He turned on me. He thought I was siding with the stranger." Silas's voice was devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrible. He drew his gun. He was fast, drunk, but fast. "I didn't think. My hand just moved. I shot him in the chest." He looked surprised. "That's what I remember most. He looked surprised that I was the one who killed him." He looked up at Nora. "The law said it was self-defense. Witnesses said he drew first. But I put a bullet in a friend because I was scared of dying. I see his face every time I close my eyes." The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of secrets kept, but the silence of burdens shared. The walls between them, built of shame and fear, crumbled into dust. Silas reached out his hand, palm up, on the rough wood of the table. Nora looked at it. It was a hand that had killed. Yes, but it was also the hand that had lifted her trunk, shielded her from the storm, and mended her fences. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed over hers. His grip was rough, calloused, but incredibly gentle. It was an anchor. Nora felt a jolt go through her, a pulse of heat that started in her fingertips and flooded her chest. It was grief, yes, and relief, but tangled with it was something else, desire, sharp and undeniable. She looked at him. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the harsh angles of his cheekbones and the depth of his eyes. He was looking at her not as a victim, and not as a project, but as a woman. "Come here," he murmured. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Nora stood up. She walked around the table. She felt as though she were moving through water, everything slow and heightened. She stood beside his chair. Silas turned toward her. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones. He looked at her with a fierce, aching intensity, letting her see everything, his guilt, his loneliness, his want. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the barn. That had been an impulse. This was a decision. His lips were warm and firm. He tasted of coffee and whiskey. Nora stood frozen for a second, her heart hammering. And then she let go. She leaned into him. She brought her hands up to his shoulders, her fingers curling into the cotton of his shirt. The kiss deepened. It became hungry. Years of loneliness, of being touched only in anger or not at all, crashed into that small room. Silas made a low sound in his throat, a groan that was half prayer, half growl. He pulled her closer. Nora didn't think. She followed the pull. She climbed into his lap, straddling his legs, her nightdress riding up. The position was vulnerable, exposing, but she didn't care. She wanted to be close to him. She wanted to erase the space between them. His arms went around her, holding her tight against him. His hands moved over her back, mapping the curve of her spine through the thin fabric. His touch was reverent, almost worshiping. Then, his hand moved to her waist, squeezing slightly. Nora flinched. It was a reflex, born of memory. Her body remembered pain even when her mind wanted pleasure. She pulled back slightly, gasping. Silas froze instantly. He didn't hold her tighter. He didn't push. He went completely still. "Nora," he whispered against her hair. "I'm sorry," she stammered, shame flooding her. "I'm sorry." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. His hands remained on her waist, but they were light now, barely resting there. "Do not apologize," he said firmly. "We stop. If you want to stop, we stop." Nora looked at him. She saw the restraint in his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. He wanted her. She could feel the evidence of it against her thigh, but he was willing to walk through fire before he frightened her. She realized then that this was not Thomas. This was not taking. This was giving. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to stop. I need a moment. Take all the moments you need," he said. He waited. He let her set the pace. He let her be the one to lean back in. When she kissed him again, the fear was still there, a flickering shadow, but it was drowned out by a stronger feeling. Safety. Silas stood up, lifting her with him as if she weighed nothing. He carried her not to the cot, but to the bedroom. He laid her down on the quilt. The darkness of the room was no longer terrifying. It was a cocoon. They moved with hesitant steps. Every brush of skin, every unbuttoning, was a question asked and answered. Is this okay? Yes. Is this safe? Yes. When his skin finally met hers, warm and rough against her softness. Nora felt a sob rise in her throat. It wasn't sadness. It was the overwhelming realization that touch could be something that healed. It could be something that made you feel whole rather than broken. Silas moved over her with a fierce determination to make her feel cherished. He whispered her name in the dark, over and over, like a litany. And for the first time in her life, Nora Vance was not just a body to be used. She was a woman, chosen and wanting, in the arms of a man who saw her as his salvation. The dawn came too soon. Gray light seeped through the cracks in the curtains, painting the room in soft, monochrome tones. Nora lay with her head on Silas's chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. She traced the jagged white line of an old scar on his shoulder with her fingertip. He was asleep. His face relaxed. The lines of worry smoothed away. The outside world felt a million miles away. The town, the rumors, Arthur Vance, the sheriff, they were phantoms. In this bed, in this house, there was only this. She allowed herself a dangerous luxury. She imagined a future. She imagined winter coming, snow banking against the logs, the two of them safe inside by the fire. She imagined spring, the creek swelling, the calves being born. She imagined a life where she did not have to run. It was a beautiful, fragile illusion. It shattered 3 hours later. Silas woke, kissed her forehead, and went out to start the chores. Nora rose, washed, and dressed, feeling a strange, shy happiness humming in her veins. She went to the kitchen to start breakfast. She was slicing bacon when the door flew open. Silas stood there. His face was gray. His eyes were wild. "Stay here," he commanded. "Silas? What is it?" He didn't answer. He grabbed his rifle from the rack and turned back out the door. Nora dropped the knife and ran after him. She stopped on the porch, her hand flying to her mouth. Smoke was rising thick and black against the blue sky. It wasn't the house. It was the barn. Or rather, what was left of the hay shed attached to the side of the main barn. It was smoldering, a blackened skeleton of timber. The fire had evidently been set in the early hours, burning itself out before they woke, or perhaps damped down by the heavy dew before it could consume the main structure. But the damage was done. Silas was walking toward the ruin, his stride long and angry. Nora ran to catch up. When they reached the shed, the smell of wet ash and scorched meat hit them. Lying in the mud near the blackened posts was a calf. It hadn't been burned. Its throat had been cut. Nora gagged, turning away. Silas stood over the animal, his knuckles white as he gripped the rifle. He was staring at the side of the main barn, which had been scorched but was still standing. There were words painted there, crude, dripping letters done in tar, or perhaps a mixture of mud and axle grease. "Whore!" The word screamed from the wood. It was a slap in the face, a violation. Nora felt her knees give way. She sank into the dirt, staring at the word. "They did this," she whispered. "Because of me." Silas turned. His eyes were terrifying. He looked at the horizon, as if looking for a target. "Cowards!" he spat, "coming in the night, killing a helpless animal." Nora scrambled up. She grabbed his arm. "Silas, you have to let me go." He looked down at her, frowning. "What? You have to let me leave," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Look at this. They will burn everything you have. They will kill your stock. They will kill you. I brought this on you." She started to back away. "I'll pack. I'll walk to the road. I'll go." Silas moved faster than she thought possible. He dropped the rifle and grabbed her shoulders, spinning her around to face him. "Stop it," he roared. "Let me go," she sobbed, struggling against him. "I am ruining your life. You are not going anywhere." Silas shook her, just once, hard enough to snap her attention to him. He lowered his voice, but the intensity remained, vibrating in the air between them. "You didn't strike the match. Nora, they did. They chose to be cruel. They chose to be small." He released one hand and pointed at the scorched wall. "I will be damned if I let them blame their cruelty on your existence. You hear me? I will not let them win, but the cost." She whimpered. "I don't care about the cost," Silas said. His voice was hoarse. "I care about you. I care about us. This is just wood and hay. We can rebuild wood. I cannot rebuild you if you leave." He pulled her into his chest. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his shirt, sobbing uncontrollably. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, his eyes fixed on the horizon, daring the world to come closer. By noon, the ranch hands had arrived from the bunkhouse near the south pasture. There were only 3 of them. Red, the foreman, looked at the barn, then at the calf, then at Silas. He took off his hat and scratched his head. "This is bad business, boss," Red said quietly. "I know," Silas said. "It's that brother of hers, isn't it? Or is money paying locals to do his dirty work?" "Likely," Silas agreed. One of the other hands, a young man named Billy, who had family in town, hung back. He wouldn't look Silas in the eye. "I can't stay, Mr. Thorne," Billy mumbled, kicking at the dirt. Silas looked at him. "You quitting?" "Billy, my ma. She says I can't work for a man living in sin. She says it ain't right. And now this. Folks are saying you're bringing a curse down on the valley." "Let him go," Red growled. Silas nodded. "Go on then. Billy, pick up your wages." Billy scurried away, looking relieved. The loss hit Silas hard. He was short-handed as it was. Losing a man now, with the harvest approaching and winter on its heels, was a disaster. It underscored just how high the price of his loyalty was going to be. Night fell over the ranch. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of the morning's violence. Silas and Nora stood on the porch of the cabin. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The line had been drawn. The war had begun. The stars above were cold and indifferent. Millions of unblinking eyes watching the small drama unfold on the vast plain. Silas wrapped his arm around Nora's waist. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. She was exhausted, drained of tears, drained of fear. All that was left was a stubborn, diamond-hard resolve. They stood together in the ash and the dark, 2 outcasts clinging to the thin thread of hope that if they endured long enough, if they just refused to break, the truth might eventually outlast the hatred. Silas kissed the top of her head. "We rebuild tomorrow," he said softly. "Yes," Nora answered. "We rebuild." The smoke from the burned barn hung over the valley for 3 days, a gray stain against the hard blue of the Wyoming sky. In the town of Bitter Creek, the smell of wet ash and scorched timber did not elicit sympathy. It elicited a grim, satisfied silence. On Sunday morning, the church bell tolled with a heavy, judgmental rhythm. The pews were full, the air thick with the scent of lavender water and self-righteousness. Reverend Miller stood behind the pulpit, his face flushed with the fervor of his message. He did not speak of charity. He spoke of cleansing fire. "The Lord is a jealous God," the Reverend thundered, his fist striking the wood of the lectern. "He does not suffer the wicked to prosper. When we see the flames consume the works of man, we must ask ourselves, what rot lay at the foundation? What sinful arrangements were made in the dark that the light of day has now exposed?" He paused, letting the silence stretch. Eyes shifted. Heads turned toward the back of the church, to the empty pew where Silas Thorne had once sat, and to the shadows near the door where Nora Vance used to stand. The spaces were empty, but the ghosts of the outcasts filled the room. "We must protect our community," the Reverend continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We must guard against the Jezebels who lure good men from the path of righteousness, and the men who let their lust blind them to the laws of God and decency." In the front row, Mrs. Gable nodded vigorously, her bonnet bobbing like a buoy in rough water. The town had decided. The fire was not a crime. It was a verdict. 2 days after the fire, Sheriff Brady rode out to the ranch. He did not come with a posse to hunt the arsonists. He came alone, riding a mare that looked as bored as he was. Silas met him at the gate. The rancher was covered in soot, his hands blistered from clearing the wreckage of the hay shed. He held a shovel like a weapon. "Sheriff," Silas said, "you took your time." Brady shifted his weight in the saddle, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Silas's boot. "It is a long ride. Thorne, and I have real crimes to solve in town." "Real crimes?" Silas asked, his voice tight. "Someone torched my barn. Someone slaughtered a calf." That is arson and destruction of property, is it? Brady looked past Silas at the blackened ruins. Or is it an accident? Hay sheds go up all the time. Wet hay heats up, catches a spark. It was arson, Silas said, pointing to the wall where the word whore was still faintly visible beneath the hasty layer of whitewash he had applied. And the calf didn't cut its own throat. Brady shrugged. Could be insurance. Could be you are looking for sympathy. Or maybe you and that woman had a lover's quarrel that got out of hand. Passion makes people do foolish things. Silas took a step forward, his knuckles white on the handle of the shovel. Get off my land. Brady, I'm going, Brady said, turning his horse. But take a word of advice. You brought this trouble on yourself when you took in a fugitive. The town is tired of the drama. Thorn. If you burn down the rest of the place yourself, don't expect the bucket brigade to come running. He rode away without looking back. Silas watched him go, the rage in his chest cold and solid as a stone. Arthur Vance was not a man to miss an opportunity. He sensed the weakness in Silas's position, the way the law had turned its back. He appeared at the boundary fence on Thursday. He did not cross the line. He sat on his rented stallion, dressed in a fresh coat, watching Nora as she hung laundry on the line near the cabin. Nora froze when she saw him. She dropped a wet shirt into the dirt. Arthur tipped his hat, a mocking, courtly gesture. You look tired. Nora, he called out. The country life does not seem to agree with you. You are thinning out. Go away. Arthur, she shouted, her voice trembling. I am just offering a solution, he said, smoothing his gloves. This, living in squalor, surrounded by enemies, it is beneath you, and it is dangerous. Look at the barn. Next time, it might be the house. He paused, letting the threat sink in. Come back with me, Nora. Come quietly. We will go east. You will stand trial. I will speak to the judge. I can ensure you are placed in a comfortable facility for the mentally feeble. It is better than hanging or burning. Silas emerged from the cabin. He did not have a shovel this time. He had his Colt revolver strapped to his hip, the leather thong off the hammer. He walked to the fence, stopping 10 feet from Arthur's horse. He didn't shout. He didn't bluster. He simply rested his hand on the butt of the gun. You have 3 seconds, Silas said. Arthur sneered. You are a violent man. Thorn, it will be your undoing. 1, Silas counted. Arthur's eyes flickered to the gun, then to Silas's face. He saw the intent there. He saw a man who had stopped caring about consequences. Arthur wheeled his horse around. You cannot guard her forever, he shouted over his shoulder. Every man has to sleep sometime. Silas watched him ride until he was a speck on the horizon. Then he turned to Nora. She was shaking, her arms wrapped around herself. We cannot keep living like this, Silas said, waiting for the next match to be struck. That night, by the light of the oil lamp. Silas laid his map on the table. I have to go to Silverton, he said. Silverton was the county seat, a 2-day ride to the north. It was where the district records were kept. Nora went pale. No, you can't leave. I have to, Silas said, running a hand through his hair. Brady won't help us. The town is against us. Arthur has them all convinced you are a devil. The only way to stop this is to prove he is lying. But how? Records, Silas said. Police reports from St. Louis. Coroner's inquests. If Arthur paid people off, there might still be paper trails. And there was a woman. You mentioned a neighbor? Mrs. Abernathy, Nora whispered. She lived across the hall. She heard everything, but she was afraid of Arthur. Fear fades, Silas said. Or it can be bought. I have $700 in the bank in Silverton. It is everything I have left. I will find the records. I will telegraph St. Louis. I will find a witness who isn't in Arthur's pocket. Take me with you, Nora begged, gripping his arm across the table. Please, Silas, don't leave me here alone. I can't take you, he said gently. We can't leave the ranch empty. If we both go, Arthur will burn the house down before we are 10 miles up the road. Someone has to hold the ground. I can't do it, she cried. I am not like you. I can't shoot a man. Yes, you can, Silas said. He stood up and went to the gun rack. He took down the Winchester. He walked over to her and pressed the cold steel into her hands. You are not the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach. Nora, you are stronger. You survived Thomas. You survived the town. You will survive this. He looked deep into her eyes. If anyone comes, you bolt the door. You wait. If they break it down, you aim for the center of the chest, center mass. You don't hesitate. You pull the trigger until the gun is empty. Can you do that? Nora looked at the rifle. It was heavy, smelling of oil and wood. She looked at Silas. She saw the desperation in his face, the need to fix this for her. Yes, she whispered. I can do it. He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and promise. I will ride fast, he said. 4 days. 5 at the most. Keep the doors locked. Silas left an hour before dawn. Nora watched him ride out, a shadow merging with the dark sagebrush. When he was gone, the silence of the ranch changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. The first 2 days passed in a blur of anxiety. Nora slept with a rifle in the bed beside her. Every creak of the house, every howl of a coyote, sent her heart into her throat. She did the chores with the rifle slung over her back, scanning the horizon constantly. On the 3rd day, the visitors came. It was not Arthur. It was a buggy, followed by 2 riders. It was a delegation of women from the church, escorted by 2 of the older deacons. Nora saw them coming from the porch. She went inside, bolted the door, and checked the load in the Winchester. But when they stopped in the yard, she realized they were not armed with torches. They were armed with Bibles and indignation. She stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in one hand, barrel pointed at the floorboards but visible. Get off my land, she said. Mrs. Gable sat in the buggy, looking at the rifle with distaste. We have come to save you, the storekeeper's wife announced. I don't need saving, Nora said. We are here to offer you a way out. Mrs. Gable continued, raising her voice. The church has taken up a collection. We have enough for a ticket to San Francisco. You can leave. Today. You can stop this shameful display. You mean you want me gone so you don't have to look at me? Nora said. We want to protect our children. Mrs. Gable snapped. We want to protect the sanctity of marriage. You are living in sin with that man. You are a murderer hiding from justice. I am not a murderer. Nora's voice rang out, clear and sharp across the yard. I defended myself against a man who was beating me. And I am not living in sin. I am living in the only place that offered me shelter when you Christians slammed your doors in my face. We know what you are, one of the deacons shouted. No, you don't, Nora said. She stepped to the edge of the porch, gripping the porch railing with her free hand. You know rumors. You know lies told by a man who wants to steal my life. I have paid for my past. I have paid for it in blood and bruises and fear. I will not apologize for surviving, and I will not leave. The group fell silent. They had expected weeping. They had expected shame. They had not expected iron. In the back of the buggy, a young woman named Sarah, the blacksmith's wife, looked at Nora. Sarah had a bruise on her wrist that she kept covered with her shawl. She looked at Nora's defiant stance, the rifle, the fire in her eyes. She's right, Sarah whispered, low enough that only Mrs. Gable heard. Hush, Mrs. Gable hissed. We are wasting our time. Mrs. Gable declared, snapping the reins. If she wants to stay and face the wrath of God, so be it. The buggy turned. Sarah looked back at Nora one last time. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a tragic sort of envy. Nora watched them go. Her knees were shaking, but she did not sit down until they were out of sight. In Silverton, Silas Thorne was fighting a different kind of battle. He had spent 2 days in the basement of the courthouse, coughing in the dust, going through telegraph logs and transferred files. The clerk, a sour-faced man with ink-stained fingers, had been unhelpful until Silas slid a $20 gold piece across the counter. Finally, he found it. It was a copy of the coroner's report from St. Louis, sent to the territory when the initial warrant was issued. It had been buried in a mislabeled file. Deceased. Thomas Vance. Cause of death: cranial trauma consistent with a backward fall. Note: deceased had a blood alcohol level of 0.20. Bruising on the subject's hands indicates a physical altercation prior to death. It wasn't proof of murder. It was proof of a fight. But the real gold was the witness statement attached to the file, one that had been dismissed by the local magistrate in St. Louis at Arthur's urging. Witness: Mrs. Martha Abernathy. Statement: I heard him screaming at her. I heard things breaking. She was crying for him to stop. Then the crash. That brother of his, Arthur, he was there 10 minutes later. He told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd lose my apartment. Silas found Mrs. Abernathy not in St. Louis, but listed in a forwarding address in the file. She had moved to a mining camp just outside Silverton to live with her son. He rode there immediately. She was a washerwoman now, gray-haired and tired, her hands red from lye. When Silas told her who he was and why he was there, she tried to close the door. He is a powerful man, she whispered. Arthur Vance. He owns people. He is going to kill her, Silas said, holding the door open. He is going to hang an innocent woman because she fought back. You saw it, Martha. You heard it. The old woman looked at Silas. She saw the dust on his coat, the desperation in his eyes. I'm old, she said softly. I'm tired of being afraid. She packed a bag. The ride back was a nightmare. A late summer storm had rolled in, turning the sky black. Rain lashed down in sheets. When they reached the Sweetwater River, it was swollen, a churning brown torrent tearing at the banks. We can't cross. Mrs. Abernathy shouted over the roar of the water. We have to, Silas yelled back. He tied a rope around his waist and secured it to her saddle. He led his horse into the water first. The current grabbed them, icy and violent. His horse stumbled, water rushing over the saddle. Silas fought the river, his muscles screaming, guiding the animals toward the far bank. He thought of Nora. He thought of the rifle in her hands. He thought of Arthur Vance's cold smile. Move, he commanded the horse. Move or we all die. They scrambled up the muddy bank on the other side, exhausted, soaking wet, shivering uncontrollably. But they were across. They were still 10 miles from Bitter Creek. In Bitter Creek. The mood had shifted from judgment to violence. Arthur Vance had spent the afternoon in the saloon. He had bought whiskey for the miners, for the drifters, for the men who felt the world owed them something. He spoke of justice. He spoke of moral courage. The law is too slow, Arthur shouted, standing on a chair. The sheriff is afraid to act, but are we afraid? Are we going to let a harlot and a killer make a mockery of our town? No, the men roared. They gathered at dusk. It was a small mob, perhaps 12 men. But 12 men with whiskey in their bellies and rope in their saddlebags were a dangerous thing. The sun was setting, painting the sky a bruised purple and blood red. Let's ride, Arthur commanded. Nora was in the kitchen when she saw the dust. It was a cloud rising from the road, moving fast. She went to the window. In the fading light, she saw the shapes of riders. She saw the flicker of torches. They were coming. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over her. She wanted to hide under the bed. She wanted to run out the back door into the sagebrush. Center mass. Silas's voice echoed in her mind. You are a survivor. She took a breath. She forced her hands to stop shaking. She shoved the heavy oak table against the front door. She dragged the dresser from the bedroom and wedged it against the back door. She blew out the lantern, plunging the house into darkness. She took the Winchester and a box of shells. She went to the front window, cracked it open 2 inches, and knelt on the floor. She waited. The riders thundered into the yard. They pulled up in a cloud of dust and noise. Horses stomped. Men shouted, "Come out! Nora!" Arthur's voice cut through the din. "Come out, and we will be gentle." Nora rested the barrel of the rifle on the sill. She pressed the stock against her shoulder. "Get back," she screamed. Her voice cracked, but it was loud. "I'm armed." Laughter rippled through the mob. "She's got a pea shooter," one man yelled. Arthur rode closer. "Don't be stupid. "Nora, you can't fight us all." Nora sighted on the dirt, 5 feet in front of Arthur's horse. She pulled the trigger. Boom! The rifle kicked hard. Dirt sprayed up into the horse's face. The animal reared, screaming. Arthur had to fight to keep his seat. The laughter died instantly. "The next one goes in your chest." "Arthur!" Nora shouted. "I swear it!" The men hesitated. They had expected a weeping woman, not a muzzle flash. The reality of a bullet is a sobering thing, even to a drunk man. "Rush the door!" Arthur screamed, regaining control of his horse. "There is only one of her. Break it down!" 2 men dismounted and ran toward the porch. Nora jacked the lever, ejecting the spent shell. She aimed at the door. Center mass! Center mass! She was sobbing softly, tears blurring her vision, but her finger was tight on the trigger. Just as the men's boots hit the porch steps, a sound rolled across the valley. It was the thunder of hooves, approaching from the east. Not a trot, but a full gallop. The mob turned. 3 riders burst out of the twilight. Silas Thorne, wet and muddy, riding like a demon. Beside him, a deputy marshal with a silver star gleaming on his chest, and behind them, a terrified old woman clinging to her saddle horn. "Hold!" the deputy roared. His voice was the voice of federal authority, loud and undeniable. He pulled his horse to a sliding stop between the mob and the porch, his own gun drawn and leveled at the crowd. "Drop your weapons. Now!" The men in the mob looked at the star. They looked at the deputy's hard face. They looked at each other. This wasn't Sheriff Brady. This was a federal marshal from the territory office. This was prison time. One by one, hands lowered, guns were holstered. Arthur Vance sat on his horse, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "Who are you?" Arthur demanded. "This is a local matter. I am Deputy Marshal Hughes," the lawman said, "and this is a federal investigation into extortion and the obstruction of justice." Silas jumped from his horse. He didn't look at the mob. He ran to the window. "Nora!" he shouted. "It's me! Open the door!" Nora scrambled to pull the table away. She threw back the bolt and flung the door open. She stumbled out onto the porch, the rifle still in her hand. "Silas!" He rushed up the steps and pulled her into his arms. He was soaking wet, shivering, but he was there. "I told you," he gasped against her hair. "I told you I'd come back." The deputy turned to the mob. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "I have here a sworn affidavit from Mrs. Martha Abernathy," he announced, gesturing to the old woman. "She witnessed the death of Thomas Vance. She witnessed this man," he pointed at Arthur, threatening her into silence. "And I have the coroner's report that confirms Thomas Vance was drunk and aggressive." The deputy looked at Arthur. "Arthur Vance, you are under arrest for attempted murder, extortion, and inciting a riot." The mob began to back away. The spell was broken. They were suddenly just men standing in a ranch yard, ashamed and afraid. Arthur sat frozen. His world was collapsing. The lies, the power, the reputation, it was all dissolving. He looked at Nora, standing in Silas's arms. He saw the relief on her face. He saw the love, hatred, pure and black. Snapped something in his mind. "If I can't have justice," he screamed, "no one will." He drew his gun. He didn't aim at the deputy. He aimed at Nora. Silas saw the movement. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. "No!" Silas threw himself in front of Nora, twisting his body to shield her. Bang! The sound was deafening. Silas jerked violently. He groaned, a terrible, wet sound, and collapsed backward, dragging Nora down with him. Bang! Bang! The deputy fired twice. Arthur Vance was thrown from his saddle. He hit the dust hard and didn't move. Silence slammed back down on the ranch. Nora scrambled to her knees. "Silas! Silas!" He was lying on the porch floorboards. Blood was blooming on his side, soaking his white shirt, dark and spreading fast. "Silas!" She pressed her hands over the wound, desperate to stop the flow. Her dress, her hands, everything was suddenly warm and sticky with his blood. He looked up at her. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. "Did I get him?" he rasped. "Yes," she sobbed. "You got him. You saved me. Stay with me. Silas, please, God, stay with me. The mob was scattering, riding away into the darkness like frightened cattle, desperate to distance themselves from the violence they had courted. The deputy was checking Arthur's body, then running toward the porch. Silas's eyes fluttered. He gripped Nora's hand, his fingers leaving bloody streaks on her skin. "Nora," he whispered. "I'm here," she cried, leaning over him, her tears falling onto his face. "I'm right here. Don't leave. I'm not going anywhere," she vowed. "I'm staying right here." The deputy knelt beside them, pulling a bandage from his kit. The legal tide had shifted. The truth was out. But as Nora watched the light fading in Silas's eyes, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the heartbeat beneath her hands, struggling against the night. The bullet that took Silas Thorne down had passed through the meat of his side, missing the lung by a fraction of an inch but shattering a rib before exiting. It was a messy, angry wound, but the bullet was gone. The fever, however, was a stubborn squatter that refused to leave. For 7 days, the small cabin on the edge of the creek became a world narrowed down to the circle of lamplight and the sound of labored breathing. The bed, where they had once discovered the desperate, hushed language of their bodies, was now a battlefield. Silas burned with a heat that radiated through the sheets. He thrashed in the grip of nightmares, calling out names Nora did not know, men from the war, the friend he had killed in Abilene, and often with a terrified urgency. Her own name. Nora did not leave him. She slept in the chair by the bedside, her head resting on the mattress, waking at every shift of his body. She became a creature of water and cloth. She wrung out cool rags from the bucket of creek water, pressing them to his forehead and neck. She trickled willow bark tea between his cracked lips, soothing the fire in his blood. The deputy marshal, Hughes, stayed for 2 days to ensure the transfer of Arthur Vance. Arthur had survived the fall from his horse with a broken leg and a bruised ego, but his power was broken. He was shackled and loaded into a wagon bound for the territorial prison, shouting threats that vanished into the wind. Mrs. Abernathy, looking 10 years younger despite her exhaustion, rode with the deputy to testify. When they left, the silence returned to the ranch, but it was a heavy, waiting silence. Nora moved through the days in a haze of exhaustion. She changed bandages with hands that no longer shook, cleaning the wound with boiled water and whiskey, ignoring the coppery smell of blood that seemed permanently etched into her skin. "Stay with me, Silas," she would whisper in the darkest hour of the night, when the wind howled around the eaves like a mourning woman. "You promised to rebuild. You cannot rebuild a house if the foundation is gone." She told him stories while he tossed in delirium. She told him about the farm in Ohio, about the smell of her mother's apple pie, about the way the light hit the dust in the hayloft where she used to hide. She spoke of a future she was too afraid to fully believe in, painting pictures of a new barn, of cattle fat on summer grass, of a life where they did not have to look over their shoulders. Outside the window, the world was indifferent to their struggle. The winter, which had held the land in a clenched fist, began to loosen its grip. The harsh, biting mornings gave way to a softness in the air. The snow on the high peaks began to weep into the valleys, turning the creek into a roaring, muddy torrent. Patches of green, wild rye and buffalo grass began to push through the brown, scarred earth of the pasture. The willows along the bank swelled with buds. The ranch bore the scars of the fire and the neglect of the last week, but life insisted on returning. It pushed up through the ash. It demanded to be seen. By the second week, Nora had to go to town. The pantry was empty, and they needed fresh bandages and laudanum. She harnessed the buckboard herself, her movements efficient and practiced. She took the Winchester, sliding it into the scabbard by her feet. She was not afraid. But she was finished with being careless. The ride into Bitter Creek felt different. The air smelled of mud and thaw. When she rolled down the main street, the town seemed smaller, stripped of its ominous power. People stopped to watch her pass. Their reactions were a map of the town's fractured conscience. Mrs. Gable, sweeping the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile, saw the wagon and turned her back sharply, retreating into the store as if Nora carried a plague. Two men loitering by the saloon stared at their boots, suddenly fascinated by the dust. They were the ones who had ridden with the mob, the ones who had seen a woman defend her home with a rifle and a truth they couldn't swallow. But not everyone looked away. Sarah, the blacksmith's wife, the young woman who had stood on the porch with the church group, was crossing the street. She stopped. She looked at the wagon, at Nora's tired eyes and straight spine. Sarah nodded. It was a small, curt gesture, but in the social economy of Bitter Creek, it was a revolution. Nora pulled the team up in front of the livery. Elias, the blacksmith, came out wiping his hands on a rag. He was a giant of a man, quiet and slow to anger, who had lost his first wife years ago to a fever that gossip said was caused by despair. "How is he?" Elias asked, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "He is fighting," Nora said. "The fever is breaking, I think, but he is weak." Elias nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin. "Bear grease and herbs," he said, handing it up to her. "My mother used to make it. Good for healing flesh that's been torn. Keeps the skin from drawing tight when it scars." "Thank you, Elias," Nora said, her throat tight. He looked at the rifle at her feet, then up at her eyes. "You tell him. Tell him when he is up. I have some seasoned timber that might do for framing a barn. I can't pay for the beef I bought last month, but I can trade work." Nora looked at him, tears pricking her eyes. "I will tell him." She did her shopping quickly. The town was not transformed. There were still whispers, still cold shoulders, but the wall of hostility had cracked. The truth about Arthur Vance and the revelation of Nora's past had shamed enough decent people that the mob could no longer claim to speak for everyone. On the 10th day, a rider arrived from Silverton. It was a courier from the marshal's office. He handed Nora a thick envelope sealed with wax. She sat by the stove, the paper trembling in her hands. Silas was asleep, his breathing finally deep and regular, the flush gone from his cheeks. She broke the seal. The letter was written in the precise, dry language of the law. It detailed the arrest of Arthur Vance. It confirmed the statements of Mrs. Abernathy and the findings of the review board regarding the death of Thomas Vance. It is the opinion of this office. The letter read that the death of Thomas Vance was an unfortunate event precipitated by his own aggression. No charges are pending against Mrs. Nora Vance. Furthermore, we advise that any pursuit of this matter be considered closed with prejudice. There was a separate note from Deputy Hughes. "You are free, ma'am. Stop running." Nora stared at the words. She read them 3 times. No charges. Closed. Free. She stood up, feeling dizzy. The weight she had carried for 6 years, the crushing, suffocating belief that she was a criminal, a sinner, a mistake, suddenly evaporated. It left her feeling light, unmoored, as if gravity had released its hold. She looked at her hands. They were the same hands, scarred, red, worn, but they were no longer the hands of a fugitive. She walked to the window and looked out at the creek. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air that didn't taste of fear. "Nora." The voice was weak, rusty with disuse. She spun around. Silas was awake. His eyes were open, clear for the first time in days. He was looking at her. "Silas." She breathed. She crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to her knees beside the bed. She took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "You're back," she whispered. He squeezed her fingers. His grip was faint, but it was there. "I never left," he rasped. "I just took the long way around." Tears spilled down her face, hot and fast. "I thought I lost you. I thought I had finally found a place to rest, only to watch it burn down." Silas shifted, wincing as the pain in his side woke up. He reached up and wiped a tear from her jaw with his thumb. "You didn't lose me," he said. "You are the one who pulled me back. I heard you every time I wanted to let go. I heard you talking about the barn, about the apple pie." He smiled, a weak, crooked expression that broke her heart. "You are a terrible liar. Nora, you don't know how to bake a pie to save your life." She laughed, a wet, choked sound. I would learn anything." She pressed her forehead against his hand. "I was so afraid," she confessed, her voice muffled against his skin. "Not of the law. I got the letter. Silas, I am free. Arthur is gone. But when you were lying there, I realized that being free doesn't mean anything if I am alone. Losing you would hurt more than the hanging. It would hurt more than the shame." She looked up at him, her soul in her eyes. "You are my home, Silas. More than this house, more than any town. You are the only place I have ever belonged." Silas looked at her. He saw the woman who had stood in the alley and begged him not to shoot, the woman who had aimed a rifle at a mob to save his ranch, the woman who had nursed him through the fire. He swallowed hard. "Nora," he whispered. His voice was rough, scraping over the emotions he had held back for so long. "The town spread rumors about your past," he said, the words landing in the quiet room like stones dropping into a deep well. He took a breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "It is your future that matters to me." The sentence hung between them. It was a vow. It was a dismissal of every sin, every mistake, every scar she carried. It was permission to begin again. Nora leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle, careful of his pain, but it held the weight of a lifetime of gratitude. Recovery was slow. Spring arrived in full force before Silas could walk to the barn without a cane. They spent the long evenings planning. They sat at the table, drawing diagrams on the back of old envelopes. "We build the barn here," Silas said, pointing to a spot on the paper. "Higher ground. Stone foundation this time?" Elias said he'd help with the framing. "And the garden," Nora added. "We need to expand it. If we plant corn on the south side, it will shelter the beans." They talked about cattle. They talked about horses. And then, tentatively, they talked about people. "We have a lot of room," Nora said one night, tracing the grain of the wood table. "And there are people in town, people like I was, who need a place to catch their breath." Silas nodded. "I was thinking, that boy, Billy, who quit, I saw him in town. He looks hungry. His ma kicked him out anyway. Maybe he needs a second chance. And Sarah," Nora said, "the blacksmith's wife. She has a sister who was widowed young. She has 2 children and nowhere to go. She could help with the washing in the garden." "We are not a charity," Silas warned gently. "No," Nora agreed. "We are a refuge. There is a difference. One evening in May, when the air was sweet with the scent of wild plum blossoms." Silas sat on the porch whittling. Nora was shelling peas into a bowl. He stopped working and held up the object he had been carving. It was small, round, made from the polished bone of an antler, inlaid with a thin strip of silver he had hammered from an old coin. It was a ring. Nora stopped her work. "It isn't gold," Silas said, looking at the ring. "And I don't have a knee to go down on today, but I wanted to ask you." He looked at her. "I am not asking you to be my housekeeper, and I am not asking you to be my nurse. I am asking if you want to walk beside me. Equal share, equal say. No locking you away, no silencing you." He held the ring out. "I want you to choose me, Nora. Not because you have to, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to stay." Nora looked at the ring. It was rough, real, and unbreakable. It was like him. She thought of Thomas, with his diamond brooches and his velvet cages. She thought of the freedom of the open range. She reached out and took the ring. She slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I choose you," she said. She didn't say it with fanfare. She said it over a bowl of shelled peas, with dirt under her fingernails and the sun setting over the sagebrush. "I choose you today," she said, "and I will choose you tomorrow." Silas smiled, and the look in his eyes made her knees weak. The wedding was small. It took place 3 weeks later, under the sprawling arms of the great cottonwood tree by the creek. Reverend Miller had refused to officiate, citing their unrepentant history. So, Deputy Hughes, passing through on his circuit, performed the ceremony with the authority vested in him by the territory. Elias the blacksmith stood as best man, his massive arms crossed, looking solemn and proud. Sarah stood beside Nora, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Mrs. Hatcher was there, looking stiff and uncomfortable, but she had brought a dried apple cake as a peace offering. Red, the foreman, and Billy, who had returned to work, stood with hats in hands, their hair slicked down with water. Some of the townsfolk had ridden out to watch from the ridge. They sat on their horses, arms crossed, keeping their distance. They were still suspicious, still wary of the couple that had defied their judgment. But they were there. They were witnessing. Silas wore his best black coat, the one he had worn to church that first day. Nora wore a dress of pale blue calico that she had sewn herself, the color of the morning sky. When Silas took her hand to say his vows, his grip was steady. Silas, take you, Nora!" His voice carried over the sound of the rushing water. It was the voice of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side holding the only thing that mattered. Nora looked at him. She saw the gray in his beard, the lines around his eyes, the scar on his shoulder. She loved every inch of the map of his life. Nora, take you, Silas." She promised to be his partner. She promised to be his shelter. When the deputy pronounced them man and wife, Silas didn't wait. He pulled her close and kissed her. Right there under the sun and the eyes of the town. It wasn't a chaste peck, it was a claim. The small group cheered. Elias clapped his giant hands. Sarah wiped a tear. Even Mrs. Hatcher managed a thin, watery smile. That night, the house was quiet. The guests had gone. The stars were a canopy of diamonds pinned to black velvet. They lay in the bed in the back room. The window was open, letting in the cool night air and the song of the crickets. There was no shame tonight. There was no flinch of memory. Thomas was a ghost that had been banished. Arthur was a bad dream that had ended. Silas moved over her, his weight familiar and welcome. He touched her with a deep, hungry tenderness, his hands worshipping the skin that had once been bruised. Nora opened to him completely. She met his gaze in the darkness. "You are beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I am yours," she answered. The act was not a taking. It was a conversation. It was a language of breath and skin, speaking of survival and joy. It was the fierce, terrifying joy of being known, fully known, with all the dark corners and jagged edges, and being wanted anyway. Nora felt the last of the old fear dissolve. She was not a victim. She was a wife. She was a lover. She was a woman who had fought for her life and won. In the months that followed, the Thorn Ranch changed. The new barn went up, sturdy and smelling of pine. The garden expanded, bursting with squash and beans. But the biggest change was the people. The widow Sarah had spoken of arrived in late summer with 2 small children. Nora gave them the room off the kitchen that they added on. She taught the woman how to mend fences and how to dry herbs. She taught her that a woman alone was not a tragedy, but a force. Billy brought a friend, a boy who had been in trouble with the law for petty theft. Silas put a hammer in the boy's hand and told him to build something. He taught him to shoot, not to kill, but to protect. He taught him that a man's worth was measured in his word, not his wallet. The ranch became a place for the strays, for the ones the town misjudged, for the ones who needed a second chance. Bitter Creek never fully embraced them. There were still people who crossed the street when Nora approached. There were still sermons about the sanctity of tradition. But the open hostility faded. It was replaced by a grudging respect. The ranch produced the best beef in the valley. The murderess baked bread for the sick. The killer saved the blacksmith's barn when lightning struck it. Their love, once a scandal, became a quiet, undeniable force. It reshaped the corner of the world they could reach, turning a patch of dry earth into a garden of stubborn hope. The story ends in late autumn. The sun was setting, turning the fields to a sea of liquid gold. The air was crisp, smelling of frost and wood smoke. Silas and Nora stood on a small rise overlooking their land. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their hands intertwined, their fingers callous against callous. They watched the cattle moving slowly toward the creek. They watched the smoke rising from the chimney of the house they had built together. Nora leaned her head against Silas's arm. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. The day I arrived? The dust storm? I remember, Silas said. I remember thinking you looked like a bird caught in a gale. I was, she said, but I'm not anymore. She looked at the darkening sky. I am no longer afraid of what they say. Silas, let them talk. We have this. Silas turned to her. He kissed her hair, breathing in the scent of her. Let them talk. He agreed, as long as you walk beside me. Nora, the only thing that matters is the life we build. Right here, the first star appeared, bright and lonely in the vast expanse. But on the rise, two figures stood together against the coming night. The weight of the past was gone, folded into the soil beneath their feet to feed the roots of the future. The wide western skies stretched above them, vast and indifferent, but for them, it was enough. It was a roof over a home made of grit, grace, and enduring love. Thank you for listening to this story of Nora and Silas. I hope their journey through the dust and danger of the American West resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience and romance, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. Share your thoughts in English. I read every one. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.